My stepson slammed his hands into my back at the Christmas dinner table, screaming that the seat belonged to his biological father. I crashed hard onto the hardwood floor, right in front of the whole family. The porcelain gravy boat shattered into pieces everywhere, and my hip took the full, you know how she is, Dad, violent force of the impact against the solid wood. My grandkids started crying and screaming. But as I lay there, looking up at the mocking smirk on his face and the cold, detached expression, I didn't shed expression on his wife's. I didn't shed a single tear. I just had a sudden realization. My wallet had been wide open for way too long. What he didn't know was that, right then and there, his life was going to change forever. When he woke up the next morning, he would find 33 missed calls on his phone, and the comfortable reality he took for granted would completely vanish. My name is Lionel Stone. I'm 68 years old, and I've been carrying heavy loads my entire life. I built Stone Logistics from nothing but a beat-up used truck. I built but a beat-up used truck and a backbone of pure steel. You know how she is, Dad. For 40 years, I hauled steel across state lines, sleeping in freezing cabs and eating cold sandwiches just to make sure my family never knew what it felt like to go hungry. I'm a man built from asphalt and diesel, but I worked myself to the bone trying to fit into the polished world my late wife, Esther, always wanted. I raised Terrence since he was 5 years old. I gave him my last name. I gave him a job. I gave him a life of privilege. But tonight, the weight pressing down on my shoulders was heavier than any freight I had ever hauled. That Chicago winter night was completely relentless. The wind howled against the windshield of my old Ford F-150. My left knee was flaring up again, a sharp throbbing ache that always arrived like clockwork whenever the temperature dropped below zero. You know how she is. It was a constant reminder of the decades spent jumping out of truck cabs onto unforgiving concrete until the cartilage wore thin. You know how she is, Dad. I rubbed my knee to get some warmth into it and looked up at the house. It was a mansion, plain and simple. A massive, sprawling suburban estate, paid for brick by brick with my blood and sweat. Warm, golden light poured from the windows. Warm, Christmas tree stood in the bay window, its ornaments glittering like diamonds. It looked like a picture-perfect holiday card. It looked like a home, and gripped the small velvet box in my pocket. I took a deep breath and gripped the small velvet box in my pocket. Inside were 2 savings bonds for my twin grandkids. This was my first Christmas without Esther. The passenger seat where she used to sit felt deafeningly empty. I missed her laugh. I missed the way she would reach over and hold my hand whenever I got too quiet. But I told myself tonight would be okay. I still had family. I had Terrence. I had the twins. I was the head of the house now, and it was my responsibility to keep our traditions alive. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My hair was gray. You know how she is? My face lined from decades of hard labor, but my eyes were steady. I was Lionel Stone. I was the rock this family was built on. You know how she is, Dad. I pushed the truck door open and stepped into the biting wind, ignoring the sharp pain in my hip. Walking up the driveway, I passed Terrence's brand new Porsche, a luxury sports car leased entirely through my company's account. You know how she is, Dad? I brushed the snow off my jacket and opened the front door. A wave of warmth hit me instantly, carrying the scent of rosemary, roasted turkey, and expensive perfume. You know how she is, Dad. I stamped the snow off my work boots on the mat, trying to be as quiet as possible. You know how she is, Dad. From the dining room, I could hear the clinking of crystal glasses and soft jazz music playing in the background. I forced a smile and walked in. Kimberly, my daughter-in-law, looked up from the table. She wasn't smiling. She was a petite woman with sharp, calculating features. The kind of person who constantly looked like she was appraising the monetary value of everything in the room. Her eyes scanned me from my boots up to my flannel shirt, her nose wrinkling slightly as if I smelled like garbage. "You're late, Lionel," she said, her voice tight and formal, "and you're tracking sweat slush onto the hardwood. We just had these aisle floors resealed last week." I looked down. My boots were wet, but I was standing squarely on the entry rug. "You know how she is, Dad." "Sorry, Kim," I said, my voice a bit raspy from the cold. The traffic coming back from the distribution center was brutal. "You know how she is. I had to make sure the holiday bonuses were processed before the drivers headed home for the break." Terrence was sitting at the side of the table. "You know how she is, Dad," cradling a half-empty glass of scotch. He was already drunk. His tie was loosened, his face flushed red. "How she is, Dad?" He didn't stand up to greet me. He just swirled his glass and let out a sarcastic chuckle. "Always the workhorse, huh?" Terrence sneered. "You own the company. You know how she is, Dad, but you still walk around smelling like diesel and cheap gas station coffee. Go clean up. We have guests coming later. Important people. You know how she is, Dad. I don't need your blue-collar look embarrassing us tonight." The insult stung, but I swallowed it. Fushigdald. For the sake of peace and out of respect for Esther's memory, I had swallowed countless insults for 30 years. I walked down the hall to the bathroom. "You know how she is, Dad?" Washed my hands with lavender soap that smelled like luxury and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. I wasn't an embarrassment. "You know how she is, Dad. I was the engine powering every single luxury in this house." But they had completely forgotten that. When I returned to the dining room, the food was already served. Nobody had waited for me. The twins were buried in their iPads, barely acknowledging my existence. Kimberly was busy directing the hired catering staff, set with the finest china and polished silver, set with arrangement and polished silver. And right at the head of the long table sat an empty chair. It was a high-backed oak chair, crafted with my own 2 hands in my woodworking shop 40 years ago. It was the one piece of furniture from my old I refused to let go of. It was the seat reserved for the head of the family. Every single Christmas since the head of the family. Every single Christmas since 1985, I sat there. It was my chair. I walked toward it, my limp more noticeable as the exhaustion set in. I was ready to finally sit down, carve the turkey, and propose a toast to Esther. I placed my hands on the back of the chair. Suddenly, Terrence slammed his palm onto the table. The silverware rattled loudly. "Don't you dare," he shouted. I froze, looking at him in confusion. "What did you say?" I asked. "That seat isn't for you," Terrence said, standing up aggressively. He swayed slightly, his eyes filled with a mix of alcohol and deep-seated resentment. "That's the chairman's seat. It belongs to the head of this family. Now that Mom is gone, that role belongs to me." I looked around. "You know how she is, Dad." Kimberly was busy cutting the meat on her plate, pretending not to hear a thing, but I caught the subtle smirk on her face. The twins looked up, their eyes wide. "Terrence, sit down," I said calmly. "You've had too much to drink. This is my house. This is my chair." "This was Mom's house," he yelled, his voice cracking. "She's the reason this family is anything. You're just the wallet." "What?" "You're just a driver. You think, because you pay the bills, that makes you one of us? You're nothing but a glorified ATM." He marched around the table and got right in my face. He was taller than me now, younger, but soft. His hands had never lifted anything heavier than a golf club. I looked him dead in the eye. "I raised you, Terrence. You know how she is, Dad. I gave you my name when your real father walked out on you." "Don't talk about my dad." He screamed. "My dad was a free spirit. You're just a cynical old man who thinks everything resolves around a checkbook. My dad is coming tonight. I invited him, and he's going to sit in that chair. So, get out of the way." Those words broke my heart more than any physical blow ever could. He had invited Joe, the man who abandoned him, the man who abandoned him, the man who used to hurt Esther. You know how the man I spent a lifetime protecting him from. I gripped the back of the chair tighter. "No," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I'm sitting here." Terrence laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. Then, without warning, he shoved me hard. It wasn't a fight. It was a cowardly move against an old man with a bad knee. I completely lost my balance. My boots slipped on the polished wood floor. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the look of sheer terror on my granddaughter's face. I saw the chandelier swaying above. I felt gravity pulling me down. I crashed onto the floor. My hip hit the wood with a dull, sickening thud. The dining table shook, overturning the gravy boat, and hot brown liquid poured down the sleeve of my best jacket. A blinding flash of pure agony shot straight up my spine. I lay there, completely dazed. The room fell, dead, silent. Terrence stood over me, breathing heavily, his fists clenched. From my position on the floor, he looked like a giant. "Yosh, Dad, I told you to get out of the way," he muttered, though his voice trembled slightly. I looked over at Kimberly. Surely she would help. Surely. "You know how she is, Dad. She had some basic human decency left." She stood up, holding her napkin. She looked at me, then at the gravy staining the rug. "Unbelievable," she sighed. "That's a Persian rug, Lionel. Look at the mess you made." She didn't offer a hand. She didn't ask if I was okay. She turned to the server. "Can you get this cleaned up before the other guests arrive? It smells like grease." The pain in my hip throbbed sharply, but a profound chill settled deep into my soul. "You know how she is, Dad." I stared at the ceiling. I thought about Esther. I thought about the promise I made to her on her deathbed, that I would take care of them. And in that moment, lying in a puddle of gravy, looked down upon by people who lived entirely off my hard work, a realization washed over me. I had kept my promise. I took care of them. You know how she is, Dad, but I never promised to let them destroy me. I rolled over, groaning as I pushed myself up. My arms were shaking. Not a single person moved to help. The twins started to cry, but Kimberly hushed them quickly. "Stop crying," she hissed to the kids. "Grandpa is fine. He's just being dramatic." I got to one knee, then managed to get my foot under me. Using the edge of the table, I pulled "How she is, Dad." I bound myself back up to a standing position. My suit was ruined. My pride was damaged. But my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I didn't scream. I didn't push back. I didn't curse. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the velvet box containing the savings bonds, and placed it gently on the table next to the cranberry sauce. "Enjoy your dinner," I said. My voice was steady. It sounded just like the engine of my truck, reliable and unshakable. I turned my back on them. "Where are you going?" Terrence yelled, his bravado wavering slightly as the reality of what he'd done began to register. "We have guests coming. You can't just leave. Who's going to pick caterers?" I kept walking. I walked past the Christmas tree. I walked past the family photos on the mantel, photos displaying a lie I had desperately wanted to believe. I reached the heavy oak front door. I pulled it open, and the freezing wind greeted me like an old friend. I stepped out into the night. "Lionel," Terrence shouted from the dining room, "don't you walk away from me? You need us. Without us, you're just a lonely old man." I closed the door behind me. The lock engaged with a sharp, definitive click. It was a tiny sound, but it felt as final as a gavel hitting a sounding block. I walked to my truck, ignoring my limp. I climbed into the cab and started the engine. The heater roared to life. As I backed down the driveway, I saw Terrence standing by the window watching me. He looked angry, entirely entitled. He thought this just was another argument. He thought I'd be back tomorrow morning with a checkbook and an apology. He was dead wrong. I drove down the winding road, leaving the mansion far behind in my rearview mirror. I didn't go to my apartment. Instead, I headed toward downtown Chicago. I was going somewhere where emotions didn't matter. Only cold, hard facts. I was going to the office. "You know how she is, Dad." I reached for my phone on the dashboard. I didn't call Terrence. I didn't call Kimberly. I dialed a number I hadn't used during a holiday in 10 years. "Automated fraud and loss prevention," a robotic voice answered. Holding the steering wheel with one hand, my eyes locked on the snow-covered road ahead. "You know how she is, Dad." I spoke clearly into the system. "Connect me to emergency asset management." The night was just beginning, and the lesson was about to start. The silence of the hotel room felt heavier than the snow falling outside the window. "You know how she is, Dad." I sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, staring at the crisp white sheets that smelled of industrial bleach and isolation. "You know how she is, Dad." It was a stark contrast to the warm home I had just walked out of, but it felt cleaner. Here, there were no lies. There was only me and the throbbing ache in my hip. Slowly unbuttoning my shirt, I walked over to the full-length mirror. The reflection showed a gray-haired man with tired eyes. "You know how she is, Dad?" But what caught my attention was the dark bruise forming along my side. It was a deep, purplish black spreading across my skin like spilled ink. It was the tangible proof of my stepson's appreciation. I touched it gently, wincing at the sharp pain. The physical hurt was real, but it paled in comparison to the sting of the betrayal. My mind drifted back 25 years. I remembered the day I met Esther, remembered the day I met Ader. She was sitting at her kitchen table, crying, surrounded by a mountain of past due notices. Terrence was just a little boy then. "You know how she is, Dad," sitting on the floor playing with a broken toy truck. He had looked up at me with wide, fearful eyes. His biological father had left them with nothing but debt and broken promises. I stepped in. I didn't just pay the bills. I provided security. I bought a real bicycle to replace that broken toy truck. I taught that boy how to ride it. I ran behind him, holding onto the seat until my lungs burned. "You know how she is, Dad," promising him I would never let him fall. "You know how she is, Dad." I remembered his smile that day. It was genuine. It was the smile of a boy who finally felt safe. I walked back to the bed and sat down heavily. Where did that boy go? "You know how she is, Dad." When did the child I carried on my shoulders turn into the man who slammed me into the floor? The realization hit me with absolute clarity. They never loved me. They loved the stability I provided. "You know how she is, Dad." They loved the protective shield I held over their heads. To them, I wasn't a father or a husband. I was just the infrastructure. I was the power utility that kept the lights on and the heat running, and just like the utility company, you only notice it when the power goes out. I looked at the bruise again. It was a receipt. The final bill for 30 years of unreciprocated care. The epiphany didn't bring tears. It brought an icy resolve. It turned my heart into exactly what my last name implied: stone. I reached for my briefcase and pulled out my laptop. I didn't turn on the TV or dim room. I had work to do. With a cool blue light highlighting the lines, on my face. You know how she is, Dad. I logged into the corporate banking portal for Stone Logistics. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. You know how she is, Dad. These were the hands that once steered 18-wheelers through blizzards, the hands that signed paychecks for hundreds of families. Tonight, they were the hands of a surgeon preparing to remove a toxic element. I navigated to the authorized personal expense accounts. You know, she is, Dad. Years ago, I had set these up, giving Terrence and Kimberly access to secondary corporate credit cards. It was supposed to be for emergencies and family maintenance. I clicked on the transaction history. The list scrolled down the screen like an accounting of their greed. $5,000 for a handbag, $1,200 for a spa day, an $100 dinner, and $800 at us house just 2 days ago. Thousands of dollars in cash advances at a local casino. I watched the numbers blur. I had looked the other way for far too long, telling myself they were just grieving, telling myself they were young. You know how she is, Dad. But looking at the bruise on my hip, I knew I was just making excuses for people who were using me. I took a deep breath. The anger vanished, replaced by pure efficiency. I clicked on the user management tab. Next to the name Terrence Stone, there was a green button that read Active. I moved the cursor, clicked it, and the screen refreshed. The status changed to Revoked. I did the same for Kimberly's name. Revoked. Next, I accessed the primary checking accounts. The joint account I shared with Esther, which Terrence had been granted access to after her passing, held a significant balance. You know how she is. I transferred the entire $200,000 into my personal holding company's secure account, leaving exactly $100 behind. Enough for a cab ride, but not enough to buy back their lifestyle. I wasn't done yet. I picked up my phone. It was 3 a.m, but I knew Frank would answer. Frank was my head of security. We used to drive trucks together back in the 80s, and his loyalty was absolute. He answered on the second ring. Everything all right, boss? You know how she is, Dad. I need a favor, Frank, I said, my voice completely flat. I need you to remotely reset the security codes for the main estate gate. You know how she is, Dad, and I need you to flag Terrence's corporate security badge as deactivated. There was a brief pause on the line. Frank didn't ask why. You know how she is, Dad. He knew me well enough to understand I wouldn't make a call like this unless it was absolutely necessary. You know how she is, Dad. Consider it done, Lionel, Frank replied. Do you need me to send a patrol car out to the house? No, I said. Let them sleep. They're going to need their rest tomorrow. You know how she is, Dad. I hung up, closed the laptop, and the room returned to darkness. Leaning back against the pillows, I stared at the ceiling, imagining them back at the dining room table, probably still enjoying their party. I pictured Terrence laughing, raising his expensive scotch, thinking he had finally won, thinking the old man was finally out of the picture. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his feet had just completely vanished. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, I slept without a single dream. How she is, gents. The morning sun piercing through the heavy curtains woke me up. It was a bright, freezing Chicago morning. My body felt incredibly stiff. My body felt incredible fit, and my hip throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. I sat up and reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen was completely lit up with notifications, 33 missed calls, 14 9 voicemails, and 9 3 mass. I put on my glasses and unlocked the device. I put on my glasses, unlocked the device. House you messages. The first few messages had arrived late last night, right around the time I was clicking those buttons on the laptop. Hey Dad, the card just got declined. Call the bank. Lionel, this is embarrassing. The server says, the account is locked. Then, the tone shifted. An hour later, the messages turned angry. Are you serious right now? You cut off our cards. We have guests at the house, Lionel. Fix this immediately. Then came the panic this morning. Dad, please answer. The Uber account is tied to your card, and we can't even get a ride back. Lionel, are you at a hotel? We need to talk. I scrolled past them without any emotion. I played one voicemail from Terrence. His words were slurred, his voice laced with an undercurrent of pure panic. Dad, look, I'm sorry about the push, okay? It was an accident. I had too much to drink. But you can't do this. The bill here is $4,000. They're threatening to involve the authorities. You have to turn the cards back on. Just for tonight, please. I deleted the voicemail. I didn't feel a sense of satisfaction or joy. You know how she is, Dad. I just felt the cold determination of a man who had finally learned to respect himself enough to say, enough. I opened the text interface, typed a single word, no key, and hit send. Then I powered down the phone. Standing up, I walked to the window. Below me, Chicago was waking up. You know how she is, Dad. People were rushing to work and trucks were merging onto the interstate. My trucks. Stone Logistics trucks. I watched one of my trailers pull onto the highway, the company logo cleanly displayed on the side. That was my legacy. That was my name, and I intended to take it back completely. I took a shower, changed into a fresh suit from the emergency bag I kept in my vehicle, and tied my tie with absolute precision. Taking one last look in the mirror, the tired, defeated man from the night before was gone. In his place stood the headed out. I grabbed my keys and headed out. The elevator descended smoothly, and the lobby was bustling with business professionals and travelers. I walked out to the valet area, and the attendant brought my truck around. It looked completely out of place among the luxury sedans, but I didn't care. It was paid for, and it was mine. I climbed inside and checked the time, 9 a.m. The banks were open, and the lawyers would be at their desks. The transition had officially begun. I started the engine, and the roar of the motor felt like pure leverage. No, how she is, Dad. I pulled into traffic, heading not toward the house, but straight toward the place Terrence thought he controlled. I was heading to headquarters. As I drove, you know how she is, Dad. I thought about those 33 missed calls. He'd laughed about it. 33 times, he reached Dijon only because the money stopped flowing. 33 times, he panicked because his lifeline was gone. Not once did he call to ask if I was hurt. Not once did he call to genuinely apologize for what he did. That was all the confirmation I would ever need. I turned on the radio, filling the cab with jazz. You know how she is, Dad, and tapped my fingers on the steering wheel. You know how she is, Dad. Let them figure it out in the cold, I said to the empty truck. It's time they learn exactly how the real world operates. The morning sun glinted off the hood of a silver Porsche 911 as it tore down the industrial access road. I stood at the window of my second-floor corner office, watching it approach. From up here, the vehicle looked like a shiny toy racing toward a concrete wall. Terrence was behind the wheel. He was driving a car my company leased specifically for client entertainment, though he mostly used it to show off at nightclub valets. You know how she is, Dad. He was speeding, kicks of dust swirling from the tires, clearly furious. He was coming to reclaim what he thought was his. You know how she is, Dad? Expecting the old man to just sign a check and disappear quietly back into the background. You know how she is, Dad? But that passive figure had left the building. I turned away from the window and adjusted my cufflinks. For the first time in years, I wasn't wearing a company polo or the comfortable flannel shirts I preferred. Today, I wore a custom charcoal three-piece suit from Savile Row. You know how she is, Dad? I had purchased it a decade ago for a major merger meeting and hadn't worn it since. It was a bit loose now, but it still carried an undeniable authority. Looking in the mirror, the man looking back wasn't the step-a-father who carved turkeys and carved carriages and signed birthday cards. This was the chairman. This was the man who had negotiated contracts with steelworkers' unions. This was the man who had negotiated economic recessions and navigated the company through major economic recessions and forked a top. You know how she is, Dad. I picked up a thick manila envelope from my desk containing the forensic accounting reports I had compiled overnight. It had some real weight to it. Down below, the Porsche screeched to a halt in front of the main security gate, a massive structure of reinforced steel topped with security wire. You know how she is, Dad, designed to keep intruders out of a yard filled with millions of dollars in freight. You know how she is, Dad. Today, it was keeping an intruder out of the executive suites. I watched the security monitor as Terrence rolled down his window. He didn't even try using the keypad. He just slammed she is, Dad. He just slammed his hand onto the horn. The blare echoed across the yard, startling a few drivers who were conducting their morning pre-trip inspections. "Open the gate, Frank," Terrence screamed. His voice was distorted through the gate's exterior microphone, but the sheer entitlement came through perfectly clear. Frank stepped out of the security guard shack. Frank was 70 years old. We had served in the same military unit before I hired him as my very first employee. You know how she is, Dad. He walked with a bit of a limp from an old injury, but he possessed an ironclad work ethic and zero patience for nonsense. He walked calmly over to the driver's side of the Porsche. "Morning, Terrence," Frank said quietly, his breath forming a cloud of white vapor in the freezing air. "Cut the small talk, Frank," Terrence snapped. "The badge reader is broken. Open it manually." "Bow. You know how she is, Dad. I have a meeting with accounting in 5 minutes. Frank shook his head slowly, adjusting his cap. "The reader isn't broken, son. Your access has been deactivated." "You know how she is." Terrence let out a sharp, disbelief-filled laugh. "Deactivated? Do you know who I am? I run this place. My mother built this company. Now open the gate. You know how she is, Dad, or I'll ensure your employment here is terminated." Frank leaned in a bit closer, his expression completely set. "Your mother didn't build this company, Terrence. Lionel did. And my retirement is secured by a trust you can't touch. Now turn this car around. You're blocking the entrance for the working drivers." Terrence's face flushed deep red, and he revved the engine aggressively. "I'm not moving. I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Frank said. I've already contacted them. They're on their way to repossess that corporate vehicle you're sitting in. It was reported unauthorized for personal use an hour ago. As Terrence continued to argue with Frank, a second vehicle pulled up behind the Porsche, a white Range Rover. Kimberly stepped out, wearing a pristine white designer coat that cost more than Frank's monthly salary. "You know how she is, Dad?" She held her phone high in the air, the camera pointed directly at the security booth. She was broadcasting live. I watched the monitor as she immediately stepped into her performance, her face contorting into an expression of theatrical blessed distress. "Hi, everyone," she said into the phone. "You know how she is, Dad," her voice shaking with practiced emotion. I am absolutely devastated right now. We are currently outside my late mother-in-law's company, the business she poured her entire life into. Look at this. Security is actually refusing to let her son inside. My husband, she knock truxy inside. My husband is being completely locked out of his own family legacy. She walked in the camera to show to the steel gate, said. Pete Pattis. She walked closer to the steel gate, panning the camera to show the trucks and the drivers gathering in the yard. You know how she is, Dad. This is what financial control looks like, guys, she continued, her voice trembling. Lionel Stone has completely locked us out. He cut off our credit cards in the middle of the night, leaving us stranded, and now he's withholding our livelihood. We just want to do our jobs and honor Mom's memory, but he's acting like a total dictator. The drivers in the yard began to murmur among themselves. These were men and women I had known for. They drove my trucks and managed my warehouse years. They knew me well. But Kimberly was a skilled performer too. She knew exactly how to weapon desirs. She turned the camera toward a younger driver. What about you? She called out. What about you? She called out. Do you think it's fair that the founder's son is being treated like a criminal? You know how she is, Dad. The driver looked down, shifting uncomfortably, wanting absolutely no part of the drama. See? Kimberly said, turning back to her phone. Everyone here is terrified of him. Lionel is completely out of control. He actually put his hands on me last night. He physically confronted me at Christmas dinner. Just because I asked him to pass the salt, and now he's doing this. Please share this stream. We need accountability. My expression went completely cold. The ease with which she fabricated that lie was remarkable. You know how she is, Dad. She was actively attempting to damage my reputation in real time, painting me as an unstable, aggressive old man. I felt a surge of anger, but I quickly suppressed it. How she is, Dad. Anger is a destructive force. What I needed right now was absolute precision. You know how she is, Dad. I walked out of my office and headed down the stairs, bypassing the elevator entirely. I wanted to walk right through the main lobby. I wanted every single employee to see me. You know how she is, Dad. As I pushed through the heavy glass front doors, the freezing wind hit my face, but I didn't flinch. I walked straight toward the main gate. You know how spists. My polished dress shoes crunching distinctly against the gravel. The employees parted naturally as I approached. They took in the suit and the expression on my face, and the whispering stopped instantly. The entire yard fell completely silent, save for the low hum of the idling diesel engines. Kimberly saw me walking out, gasped dramatically, and pointed her phone directly at me. There he is, she claimed loudly. There he is. You know how she is, Dad. There's the man trying to take away our future. Lionel, how do you even look at yourself in the mirror? I didn't look at the phone. I didn't look at Kimberly. I walked right past her. I walked past her as if she weren't even standing there, stopping directly in front of the Porsche. Terrence remained inside. You know how she be, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white. Seeing me, he rolled his window down further and yelled, "Tell this idiot to open the gate. We're wasting time here." "Get out of the car, Terrence," I said. My voice wasn't raised, but it carried clearly across the quiet yard. "What?" Terrence said, his jaw dropping slightly. I said, "Get out of the car," I repeated, "and hand the keys to Frank." "You've got to be kidding me, Dad. You've got to be kidding me, right?" Terrence let out a nervous laugh. He glanced at the phone camera Kimberly was holding, trying to recover his swagger. "You're trying to embarrass me in front of the employees. This is just a sad power play. You're old, Lionel. You're losing your mind. Go back to bed." I pulled the thick manila envelope from under my arm, unsealed it, and drew out a single document. It was a certified corporate bank ledger. December 14th, I read aloud. You know how she is, Dad. A transfer of $25,000 from the Stone Logistics Fleet Maintenance Fund to a private shell account under the name T. Stone Consulting. Terrence's face went completely pale. December 20th, I continued. $12,000 from the corporate fuel account used to secure a luxury holiday rental in Aspen. Kimberly slowly lowered her phone, her eyes darting around erratically. January 2nd, I raised my voice just enough so that the drivers standing nearby could hear every single word. A laugh, Dad. A withdrawal of $50,000 directly from the driver's pension surplus fund. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The drivers took a step forward, their confusion instantly turning into pure fury. In this industry, you do not touch a worker's retirement. That's a lie, Terrence stammered. That was an accounting error. I can explain that. It's embezzlement. I cut him off. It's theft, and I have the digital footprint to prove it. I've already forwarded this exact packet to the district attorney's office this morning. Terrence opened his mouth, soft rebus. Dad, but no sound came out. He looked desperately to Kimberly for support, but she was already backing away, hiding her phone behind her jacket. I stepped closer to the car and leaned down until we were just inches apart. You said that chair belonged to you, Terrence. You said you were the head of this family. Listen to me very carefully. You know how she is, Dad. A real leader does not steal from the men and women who bleed for this company. I straightened up and looked over at Frank. Frank, open the gate. Frank pressed the button. The sport steel barrier rose with a loud mechanical groan. Terrence tried to summon a weak smile. See? He muttered, gripping the gear shift. I knew you were bluffing. You don't have the nerve. You're terminated, Terrence, I said. He froze. You're fired for cause, I continued. Your title is revoked. You are barred from these premises. He'd laughed about it. And if you don't step out of that vehicle within the next 30 seconds, I'm going to let the drivers have a direct conversation with you about their pension fund. I gestured to the group of uniform-clad men standing right behind me. They were cracking their knuckles, looking more than ready to hold that conversation. Terrence practically scrambled out of the driver's seat, tripping over his own feet and nearly falling into the slush. He threw the keys at Frank. You're insane, he screamed, backing away. You're going to regret this. I'll tie you up in court and take everything you have. Get off my property, I replied. Kimberly grabbed his arm, her voice a sharp hiss. Let's go. Stop talking. We need to call a lawyer right now. They walked a long, humiliating path back to her Range Rover. The entire Sooms watched the mutt in total silence. No one waved, no one the accelerator, and tore out of the driveway, kicking up the loose biegsilet, and tore out of the gravel, kicking up loose gravel. I turned back to my team. I apologize for the disruption, everyone, I said. The missing funds have already been fully restored to the pension account using my personal cash reserves. Not a single person will lose a penny. Now, let's get back to work. I handed the keys to Frank. Park this in the corporate garage, I instructed. And Frank? Yeah? Boss, fix the gate code. I don't want any more liabilities slipping in. I don't want Andy slipping in. I turned and walked back toward the building. The suit felt right. The crisp air felt right. I was completely on my own again, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt clean. The chairman was back in his proper place, and I had a company to run. The conference room at Althea Sharp's law firm smelled strongly of lemon polish and expensive leather. An atmosphere explicitly designed to intimidate. You know how she is, Dad, but Terrence and Kimberly were far too arrogant to notice. They sat on the opposite side of a massive mahogany table, looking like opportunists waiting to carve up what remained of an estate. I sat right next to Althea. I didn't look at them. You know how she is, Dad. Instead, I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the gray Chicago skyline. It was snowing again. The city looked completely frozen, but it was nothing compared to the temperature inside this room. Althea Sharp was a woman who lived up to her name. At 60 years old, you know how she is, Dad. With deep obsidian skin and eyes sharp enough to cut glass, she sat with her hands neatly folded over a thick red folder. You know how she is, Dad. She let the silence stretch on until it became unbearable. She knew better than anyone that in a high-stakes negotiation, the first person to speak is usually the one who loses. Terrence snapped first. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the water pitcher. "Let's stop wasting time," he demanded. "We know the law. My mother was married to Lionel for 30 years. That me know how she is, Dad. That means he owns half of what belonged to her estate. And since I am her only son, that means it belongs to me." Kimberly chimed in, her voice sharp and aggressive, as she pulled a printed document from her designer bag, something she had clearly taken from a generic legal advice website. Squirtle. According to state marital property guidelines, she read triumphantly, all assets acquired during the marriage are subject to division. Stone Logistics is worth millions. You know how she is, Dad. The estate is worth $3 million. We are taking our half. Either we settle this right now, or we go straight to the media and expose exactly how you're taking advantage of a grieving family. I finally turned my head to look at them. Grieving. Terrence was a 35-year-old man wearing a watch that cost more than my first commercial truck. He wasn't grieving. You know how she is, Dad. He was a dependent who had finally run out of resources. Althea slowly turned her gaze toward them, looking over the rim of her glasses. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice low, smooth, and absolute. "No, I'm not," Terrence spat. "I want a full forensic audit of the business. I want to know exactly how much cash he's hiding. And I want the keys to the lake house. Mom loved that place. It's mine." Althea let out a sigh of pure boredom. She opened the red folder, the sound of paper sliding across the wood the only noise in the room. "Let's clarify a few realities, Mr. Stone," Althea said, using the last name he barely deserved. She slid an old document across the table, preserved inside a plastic sleeve. "These are the original incorporation papers for Stone Logistics," Althea stated. "Please note the date at the bottom." Terrence snatched the paper and squinted at it. "August 4th, 1980, he read. "So what?" Althea slid a second document forward. "And this is the marriage certificate between Lionel Stospikine and Esther Williams. Note the date on this one." "June 10th, 1995, Terrence muttered. He paused, his brow furrowing. Althea leaned forward. "Do the math, Terrence. Lionel founded this company 15 years before he ever married your mother. It is classified as non-marital property. It is an independent asset. You know how she is, Dad. Your mother never owned a single share. She never served on the board. And she was never an employee. This company belongs 100% to Lionel Stone. You how sheards." Terrence threw the papers down. "That's just a legal technicality," he stammered. She supported him. "She raised me while he was out on the road. That has to count for something." "You know how she is, Dad. That counts as a family dynamic," Althea replied coldly. "It does not translate into corporate equity." Kimberly jumped in, desperately searching for a loophole. "What about the..." estate. They lived there together. That is absolutely a marital asset. We want half the value of the house. Althea smiled, though the warmth never reached her eyes. She pulled out a property deed, old and creased. Lionel purchased the land and built that home in 1990, Althea noted. 5 years before the marriage. The deed is exclusively in his name. Your mother moved in after wed. Your mother moved in after they wed. She never contributed a single dollar toward a mortgage because there never was one. Lionel paid for it entirely in cash. The room fell completely dead silent. I watched the color drain from Kimberly's face. The millions she had already spent in her mind were evaporating like steam. But Terrence shook his head, whispering, "But Mom had money. She always had money. She bought new cars. She traveled to Paris. She had jewelry. Where did that money come from?" I closed my eyes. This was the moment I had dreaded for 3 decades. I had spent 30 years protecting Terrence from the reality of his mother's financial situation because I wanted him to remember her fondly. I wanted him to believe she was the elegant, successful woman she pretended to be. But he had forced my hand. He had to face the truth. Althea looked at me, and now he had to face Schultz. Small nod. Althea looked at me, and I gave her a small nod. How she is, Dad. She revealed a fresh stack of documents, not historical records, but recent credit card statements, bank overdraft notices, and loan applications. Your mother didn't have money? Terrence, Althea said softly. She had a severe compulsion. Terrence picked up the top sheet, his hand visibly trembling. What is this? An extreme shopping addiction, Althea explained. You know how she is, Dad. Emotional soul. Your mother spent money she didn't have to feed emotional void. She bought clothes she never wore and luxury items she couldn't afford. She was also heavily involved in online voice sounding rough. I spoke up for the first time. My voice, I paid for all of it, Terrence. Every single month for 30 years, I quietly handled her debts. I paid off the secret credit cards, the online accounts, and the boutiques. I did it because I cared about her, and because I didn't want you to see that your mother was drowning in debt. Terrence shook his head. No, you're lying. She was living like royalty. She was living on borrowed time funded entirely by me, I said. Althea pointed to the final document in the folder. This is the current financial standing of Esther Stone's independent estate, Althea stated. Since she held no ownership in the business and wasn't on the property deed, you know how she is, Dad. Her estate consists solely of her personal bank accounts and her personal debts. Kimberly grabbed the paper, her eyes scanning down to the final line. She gasped. -$50,000. Kimberly shrieked. How can an estate be negative? Because, Althea explained, Lionel stopped covering her personal accounts the day she passed away. The debt remains entirely in her name. It's an American Express card that Colonel is currently $50,000 overdrawn. Althea closed the folder with a definitive thud that sounded as final as a casket closing. You know how she is, Dad. So here is the reality of the situation, Althea said, refolding her hands. There is no inheritance. There is no real estate. There are no corporate shares. The only thing Esther left behind is a $50,000 debt to American Express. Terrence stared at me, his eyes wide with shock and fear. In that moment, you know how she is, Dad. He looked exactly like the helpless little boy I used to carry on my shoulders. You know how she is, Dad. But the innocence was completely gone, replaced by the ugly reality of exposed greed. You have to pay it, Terrence whispered. You always pay it. You were her husband. I stood up. My hip was still sore, but I stood completely straight. I buttoned my suit jacket. I was her husband, I said, and I kept my vows until death parted us. You know how she is, Dad, but I am no longer your source of funding, Terrence. I am no longer your safety net. I turned toward the door. Wait, Kimberly yelled. You can't just leave us with this mess. We just signed a contract for an apartment renovation. We need that money. We're family. I paused, my hand resting on the brass door handle. I didn't bother turning around. Family doesn't assault someone at a holiday dinner, I said. Family doesn't refer to their father as a driver and a wallet. But the debt, Terrence cried out. They're going to come after the estate. They'll take her jewelry. You know how she is, Dad. Then let them take it, I replied. I opened the door, allowing the busy hum of the outside office to rush in, breaking the suffocating tension in the room. Oh, and one more thing, Althea added cheerfully from her seat. Since you brought completely meritless claims against my client, you will be receiving my hourly invoice for today's consultation. My rate is $500 an hour, and we've been here for 2 hours. I walked out, passing the reception desk and heading straight for the elevators. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't joy. You know how she is, Dad. It was something much lighter. It was the feeling of finally dropping a massive weight. After a very long journey, stepped to the elevator and pressed the lobby button. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the lobby button. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of Terrence and sitting at the table, but staring at that red folder as if it were an explosive device that had just gone off in their faces. They know how she is, Dad. They had come looking for a payout, but they had only succeeded in digging their own financial grave. I checked my watch. It was time for lunch. For the first time in years, I was going to enjoy a meal that didn't cost me my self-respect. I pulled out my phone. I had one final stop to make today. The conflict wasn't completely over. You know how she is, Dad. They would try to bounce back. Greedy people always do. But next time, they wouldn't just be dealing with a lawyer. They were going to face the consequences of trying to use my grandkids as leverage. You know how she is, Dad. I dialed the number for the private academy the twins attended. Hello, I said when the receptionist answered. This is Lionel Stone. You know how she is, Dad. I need to speak with the billing department regarding tuition for the upcoming term. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the ground floor. The doors slid open, and I stepped out into the world as a man with no wife, no dependent son, and absolutely no remaining burdens. It felt incredible. The engine of my truck idled with a low, deep rumble. You know how she is, Dad, sending a steady vibration through the steering wheel into my hands. It was Tuesday at 3 p.m. I laughed about it. You know how Dad tixt good mom. For the past decade, this had always been my favorite moment of the week. The day I picked up my grandkids from their private academy, a school that cost more per term than my first house. Sitting in a long line of luxury SUVs, my work truck felt completely out of place, but I never cared. I lived for the exact moment those double doors opened and those two little faces scanned the crowd looking for me. I lived to watch them crowd looking for me. I lived to watch them run past the luxury sedans, climb up in if I had brought any mints, and ask if I had brought any mints. I drifted slowly forward in the pickup line. Checking the rearview mirror, I made sure my face was clean and asked. I had scrubbed the grease from my hands before leaving the warehouse because I wanted to look presentable for them. I wanted to hear all about their science projects and spelling bees, keeping the lawyers and audits out of my mind for just an hour. I pulled to the herb. The school principal, Mr. Henderson, was standing there with a clipboard. Dick, the Tuesday. Dish, school to castboard. The school. You know how she is, Dad. He usually gave me a warm wave. We had chatted about baseball and the weather dozens of times. He knew I was the one who signed the tuition checks, and he knew I was the one who funded the new gymnasium. But today, Mr. Henderson didn't wave. He kept his eyes locked on his clipboard, looking visibly tense. I rolled down the window. I rolled "Afternoon, Mr. Henderson." I smiled. "Here for the twins." He walked slowly over to the truck, avoiding eye contact as he rested a hand on the door frame. He said, "Mr. Stone," he said quietly, "I'm afraid I can't release the children to you today." A cold knot formed in my stomach. "What do you mean? Is everything okay? Are they sick?" "No, they're perfectly fine," glancing back toward the building. "But we received an updated custody directive this morning. Your daughter-in-law, Kimberly Stone, filed a legal notice. It explicitly removes you from the approved pickup list. You know how she is. Claiming your presence poses an emotional risk to the children." The air left my lungs completely. "A risk? Me?" "You know how she is, Dad. The man who stayed by their bedsides when they had the flu while their parents were out at parties. The man who taught them how to tie their shoes. There must be a mistake," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm their grandfather. I pay for them to attend this school." "I know," Mr. Henderson said, his voice filled with genuine sympathy. "I know you do, Lionel, but my hands are tied. The school could face serious legal liability. You know how she is, Dad. She was very clear, and she threatened to involve security if you step onto the property." Right then, the main doors opened. "You know how she is, Dad," and a crowd of children in navy blue uniforms poured out. I saw them immediately, my twins, Leo and Maya. They were holding hands, looking around the parking lot. Leo spotted my truck, his eyes lighting up as he pointed it out. He started running toward me. Mr. Henderson stepped back and signaled to a nearby teacher, who quickly caught Leo by the shoulder. She whispered something in his ear, and Leo stopped in his tracks. "You know how she is, Dad," looking completely confused. He looked at me, then back at the teacher, and tears began to stream down his face. "Just let me talk to them," I pleaded, "just for a minute to explain." "You need to move along, Lionel," Mr. Henderson said firmly but gently. "Please, don't cause a scene in front of the students. If you remain here, I'll have no choice but to call security." He'd laughed about it. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, the leather creaked under the pressure. I watched Maya wipe a tear from her cheek. She gave me a tiny, heartbreaking wave. "You know how she is, Dad. I wanted to get out of the truck. I wanted to march past those gates. But I knew that was exactly what Kimberly wanted. She wanted me to lose my temper so she could capture a video of an unstable old man causing a disruption to use against me." I nodded at Mr. Henderson, shifted into drive, and pulled away. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror until they disappeared, fading into tiny blue specks. "You know how she is, Dad. I had never felt so completely powerless in my entire life." I drove two blocks away and pulled into a quiet side street. Turning off the engine, I rested my head against the steering wheel. I sat there for 20 minutes. You know how she is, Dad, breathing in the scent of old coffee and diesel, trying to keep myself together. Then my phone rang. You know how she is, Dad. Kimberly's photo flashed on the screen, a picture from her wedding day where she looked completely innocent. You know how she is, Dad? I stared at it before sliding the green button to answer. I didn't say a word. Kimberly's voice immediately filled the cab, sounding sweet, but with a calculated edge. How was the drive to the school, Lionel? She asked. You're completely heartless, I said, my voice low, using children as leverage. I'm protecting my household. She shot back, her tone turning icy cold instantly. You know how she is. You seem to think you could cut off our livelihood and still enjoy the benefits of being a grandfather. That's not how this works. If you want access to them, there's a cost. A cost? I repeated. Tuition is due next week, Lionel, she said carelessly. $50,000 for the spring term, plus the fees for the winter trip. I know how she is, Dad. I noticed you canceled the automatic transfer. I closed my eyes, so that was her play. I assume you'd like to see them again, she continued. Leo has a soccer game on Saturday, and Maya has a recital coming up. It would be a real shame if you missed those milestones. They grow up so fast. Are you trying to extort me using my own grandkids? I asked. I'm negotiating, she countered. Seed laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad. You reactivate the credit cards, you cover the tuition, and you drop this ridiculous investigation into the corporate accounts. You do that, and I'll put your name back on the approved list. I might even let you take them out for ice cream. I listened to her breathing on the other end of the line. She sounded how she is, Dad. She sounded completely confident, believing she had found my breaking point and that my affection for those kids was a weakness she could exploit. I'll consider it, I said. Don't take too long, she replied. The late fees start accumulating tomorrow. And, Lionel? If the payment isn't cleared by noon, you know how she is, Dad. I'll personally tell the kids you decided you didn't want to pay for their schooling anymore. I'll tell them that when it came down to a choice between your money and their education, you chose the money. Imagine how much they'll resent you then. She hung up the phone. I sat in the quiet cab as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dashboard. I felt a wave of nausea. $50,000 was nothing to me. I could write that check right now. Paying her off to secure my Tuesday afternoons would be the easiest thing in the world. But then I thought about Terrence. I remembered how I had bailed him out of every single mistake he ever made, shielding him from consequence, and look where that had led. It created a person who thought nothing me onto a floor at a family. A person who thought nothing of slamming me onto a floor at a family dinner. You know how she is, Dad. If I paid Kimberly right now, I wouldn't be helping those kids. I would be teaching them that relationships are purely transactional. You know how and that you can mistreat people as long as you have enough leverage to get what you want. I restarted the truck. I didn't head home. I drove straight back to Alva's office. I said, "Get out of the car," I repeated, "and hand the keys to Frank." You know how she is? You've got to be kidding me, right? Terrence let out a nervous laugh, glancing toward Kimberly's live stream to try and salvage his pride. You know how she is, Dad. You're trying to embarrass me in front of the crew. This is just a sad power play. You're old, Lionel. You're losing your grip. Go home and take a nap. You know how she is, Dad. I pulled the heavy manila envelope from under my arm, unsealed it, and drew out a single document. It was a certif, Dad. It was a certified corporate bank ledger. December 14th, I read aloud, my voice cutting through the crisp air. A transfer of $25,000 from the Stone Logistics Fleet Maintenance Fund to a private shell account under the name T. Stone Consulting. Terrence's face went completely pale. December 20th, I continued. $12,000 from the corporate fuel account used to secure a luxury holiday rental in Aspen. Kimberly slowly lowered her phone, her eyes darting around erratically. January 2nd, I raised my voice just enough so that the drivers standing nearby could hear every single word. You know how she is, Dad. A withdrawal of $50,000 directly from the driver's mentioned surplus fund. You know how she is, Dad. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The drivers took a step forward, their confusion instantly turning into pure fury. In this industry, you do not touch a worker's retirement. That's a lie. Terrence stammered. That was an accounting error. I can explain that. It's embezzlement, I cut him off. It's theft. You know how she is, Dad, and I have the digital footprint to prove it. I've already forwarded this exact packet to the district attorney's office this morning. Terrence opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked desperately to Kimberly for support, but she was already backing away, hiding her phone behind her jacket. I stepped closer to the car and leaned down until we were just inches apart. You said that chair belonged to you, Terrence. You said you were the head of this family. Listen to me very carefully. A real leader does not steal from the men and women who bleed for this company. You know how she is, Dad. I straightened up and looked over at Frank. Frank, open the gate. Frank pressed the button. The steel barrier rose with a loud, mechanical groan. Terrence tried to summon a weak smile. See, he muttered, gripping the gear shift. I knew you were bluffing. You don't have the nerve. You're terminated, Terrence. Terrence said, I said. He froze. You're fired for cause, I continued. Your title is revoked. You are barred from these premises. And if you don't step out of that vehicle within the next 30 seconds, I'm going to let the drivers have a direct conversation with you about their pension fund. Unshakeable. I gestured to the group of uniform-clad men standing right behind me. They were cracking their knuckles, looking more than ready to hold that conversation. You know how she is, Dad. Terrence practically scrambled out of the driver's seat, tripping over his own feet and nearly falling into the slush. He threw the keys at Frank. You're insane, he screamed, backing away. You're going to regret this. I'll tie you up in court and take everything you have. Get off my property, I replied. Kimberly grabbed his arm, her voice a sharp hiss. Let's go. Stop talking. We need to call a lawyer right now. They walked a long, humiliating path back to her Range Rover. The entire staff watched them leave in total silence. No one waved. No one said goodbye. You know how she is, Dad. As they slammed the accelerator and tore out of the driveway, kicking up loose gravel, I turned back to my team. I apologize for the disruption, everyone, I said. You know how she is, Dad. The missing funds have already been fully restored to the pension account using my personal cash reserves. Not a single person will lose a penny. Now, let's get back to work. I handed the keys to Frank. Park this in the corporate garage, I instructed. And Frank? Yeah. Boss? Frank smiled. Fix the gate code. I don't want any more liability slipping in. I turned and walked back toward the building. The suit felt right. The crisp felt right. I was completely on my own again, but for the first time in a very long time, I felt clean. The chairman was back in his proper place, and I had a company to run. The conference room at Althea Sharp's to run. The conference room at Althea Sharp's law firm, strongly of lemon polish and expensive leather, an atmosphere explicitly designed to intimidate. But Terrence and Kimberly were far too arrogant to notice. Laugh, Dad. They sat on the opposite side of a massive mahogany table, looking like opportunists waiting to carve up what remained of an estate. I sat right next to Althea. I didn't look at them. Instead, I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the gray Chicago skyline. It was snowing again. The city looked completely frozen. But it was nothing compared to the temperature inside this room. Althea Sharp was a woman who lived up to her name. At 60 years old, with deep obsidian skin and eyes sharp enough to cut glass. You know how she is, Dad. She sat with her hands neatly folded over a thick red folder. She let the silence stretch on until it became unbearable. You know how she is, Dad. She knew better than anyone that in a high-stakes negotiation, the first person to speak is usually the one who loses. Terrence snapped first. You know how she is, Dad. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the water pitcher. "Let's stop wasting time," he demanded. "We know the law. My mother was married to Lionel for 30 years. That means he owns half of what belonged to her estate. And since I am her only son, that means it belongs to me." Kimberly chimed in, her voice sharp and aggressive as she pulled a printed document from her designer bag, something she had clearly taken from a generic legal advice website. According to state marital property guidelines, she read triumphantly, "All assets acquired during the marriage are subject to division. Stone Logistics is worth millions. You know, estate is worth $3 million. We are taking our half. Either we settle this right now, or we go straight to the media and expose exactly how you're taking advantage of a grieving family." I finally turned my head to look at them, grieving. Terrence was a 35-year-old man wearing a watch that cost more than my first commercial truck. He wasn't grieving. "You know how she is, Dad." He was a dependent who had finally run out of resources. Althea slowly turned her gaze toward them, looking over the rim of her glasses. "Are you finished?" she asked, her voice low, smooth, and absolute. "No, I'm not," Terrence spat. "I want a full forensic audit of the business. I want to know exactly how much cash he's hiding. And I want the keys to the lake house. Mom loved that place. It's mine." Althea let out a sigh of pure boredom. She opened the red folder, the sound of paper sliding across the wood the only noise in the room. "Let's clarify a few realities, Mr. Stone," Althea said. "You know how she is, Dad," using the last name he barely deserved. She slid an old document across the table, preserved inside a plastic sleeve. "You know how she is, Dad. These are the original incorporation papers for Stone Logistics," Althea stated. "Please note the date at the bottom." Terrence snapped the paper and squinted at it. "August 4th, 1980, he read. "So what?" Althea slid a second document forward. "And this is the marriage certificate between Lionel Stone and Esther Williams. Note the date on this one. June 10th, 1995, Terrence muttered. He paused, his brow furrowing. Althea leaned forward. "Do the math, Terrence. Lionel founded this company 15 years before he ever married your mother. It is classified as non-marital property. It is an independent asset. You know how she is, Dad. Your mother never owned a single share, she never served on the board, and she was never an employee. This company belongs 100% to Lionel Stone. You know how Terrence threw the papers down. That's just a legal technicality," he stammered. "She supported him. She raised me while he was out on the road. That has to count for something. That counts as a family dynamic," Althea replied coldly. "You know how she is, Dad. It does not translate into corporate equity." Kimberly jumped in, desperately searching for a loophole. "What about the estate? They lived there together. You know how she is, Dad. That is absolutely a marital asset. We want half the value of the house." Althea smiled, though the warmth never reached her eyes. She pulled out a property deed, old and creased. "Lionel purchased the land and built that home in 1990, Althea noted, 5 years before the marriage. The deed is exclusively in his name. Your mother moved in after they wed. You know how she is, Dad. She never contributed a single dollar toward a mortgage because there never was one. You know how she is, Dad. Lionel paid for it entirely in cash." The room fell completely dead silent. I watched the color drain from Kimberly's face. "You know how she is, Dad." The millions she had already spent in her mind were evaporating like steam. But Terrence shook his head, whispering, "But Mom had money. She always had money. She bought new cars. She traveled to Paris. She had jewelry. Where did that money come from?" I closed my eyes. This was the moment I had dreaded For 3 decades, I had spent 30 years protecting Terrence from the reality of his mother's financial situation because I wanted him to remember her fondly. I wanted him to believe how woman she pretended to be, but he had forced my hands. 2 weeks, swru, bistad. Sis was elegant, successful woman she pretended to booze the truth. But he had forced my hand. He had pushed me down, and now he had to face the truth. Althea looked at me, and I gave her a small nod. She revealed a fresh stack of documents, not historical records, but recent credit card statements, bank overdraft notices, and loan applications. Your mother didn't have money, Terrence, Althea said softly. She had a severe compulsion. Terrence picked up the top sheet, his hand visibly trembling. What is this? An extreme. Shopping addiction, Althea explained. Your mother spent money she didn't have to fill an emotional void. You know how she is, Dad. She bought clothes she never wore and luxury items she couldn't afford. She was also heavily involved in online gambling. I spoke up for the first time, my voice sounding rough. You know how she is, Dad. I paid for all of it, Terrence. Every single month for 30 years, I quietly handled her debts. You know how she is, Dad. I paid off the secret credit cards, the online accounts, and the boutiques. I did it because I cared about her, and because I didn't want you to see that your mother was drowning in debt. Terrence shook his head. No, you're lying. She was living like royalty. Dad, she was living on borrowed time funded entirely by me, I said. Althea pointed to the final document in the folder. This is the current financial standing of Esther Stone's independent estate, Althea stated. Since she held no ownership in the business and wasn't on the property deed, you know how she is, Dad. Her estate consists solely of her personal bank accounts and her personal debts. Kimberly grabbed the paper, her eyes scanning down to the final line. She gasped. Negative $50,000, Kimberly shrieked. How can an estate be negative? Because, Althea explained, Lionel stopped covering her personal accounts the day she passed away. The debt remains in her name. It's an American Express card that is currently $50,000 overdrawn. Althea closed the folder with a definitive thud that sounded as final as a casket closing. As a casket closing. So, here is the reality of the situation, Althea said, refolding her hands. There is no inheritance. There is no real estate. There are no corporate shares. The only thing Esther left behind is a $50,000 debt to American Express. Terrence stared at me, his eyes wide with shock and fear. In that moment, he looked exactly like the helpless little boy I used to carry on my shoulders. But the innocence was completely gone, replaced by the ugly reality of exposed greed. You have to pay it, Terrence whispered. You always pay it. You were her husband. I stood up. My hip was still sore, but I stood completely straight. I buttoned my suit jacket. I was her husband, I said, and I kept my vows until death parted us. But I am no longer your source of funding, Terrence. I am no longer your safety net. I turned toward the door. Wait, Kimberly yelled. You can't just leave us with this mess. We just signed a contract for an apartment renovation. We need that money. We're family. I paused, my hand resting on the brass door handle. I didn't bother turning around. Family doesn't assault someone at a holiday dinner, I said. You know how she is, Dad. Family doesn't refer to their father as a driver and a wallet. But the debt, Terrence cried out. They're going to come after the estate. They'll take her jewelry. Then let them take it, I replied. I opened the door, allowing the busy hum of the outside office to rush in, breaking the suffocating tension in the room. Oh, and one more thing, Althea added cheerfully from her seat. Since you Since you brought completely meritless claims against my client, you'll be receiving my hourly invoice for today's consultation. My rate is $500 an hour. You know how she is, Dad, and we've been here for 2 hours. I walked out, passing the reception desk and heading straight for the elevators. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't joy. It was something much lighter. It was the feeling of finally dropping a massive weight after a very long journey. After a very long journey. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the lobby button. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of Terrence and Kimberly sitting at the table, staring at that red folder as if it were an explosive device that had just gone off in their faces. You know how she is, Dad. They had come looking for a payout, but they had only succeeded in digging their own financial grave. I checked my watch. It was time for lunch. For the first time in years, I was going to know how she is, Dad. I was going to enjoy a meal that didn't cost me my self-respect. I pulled out my phone. I had one final stop to make today. The conflict wasn't completely over. You know how she is, Dad, what they would count back. Greedy people always do. You know how she is, Dad. But next time, they wouldn't just be dealing with a lawyer. They were going to face the consequences of trying to use my grandkids as leverage. You know how she is, Dad. I dialed the number for the private academy the twins attended. Hello, I said when the receptionist answered. This is Lionel Stone. You know how she is, Dad. I need to speak with the billing department regarding tuition for the upcoming term. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the ground floor. The doors slid open and I stepped out into the world as a man with no wife, no dependent son, and absolutely no remaining burdens. It felt incredible. The engine of my truck idled with a low, deep rumble, sending steady vibration through the steering wheel into my hands. It was Tuesday at 3 in the afternoon. He laughed. For the past decade, this had always been my favorite moment of the week. The day I picked up my grandkids from their private academy, a school that cost more per term than my first house. Sitting in a long line of luxury SUVs, my work truck felt completely out of place, but I never cared. I lived for the exact moment those double doors opened, and those two little faces scanned the crowd looking for me. I lived to watch them run past the luxury sedans. I lived to watch them run past the luxury sedans and ask if I had brought any mints. I drifted slowly forward in the pickup line. Checking the rearview mirror, I made sure my face was clean. I had scrubbed the grease from my hands before leaving the warehouse because I wanted to look presentable for them. Hugh Stopel. I wanted to hear all about their science projects and spelling bees, keeping the lawyers and audits out of my mind for just an hour. I pulled up to the curb. I pulled up Prince Sopel. The school principal Henderson was standing there. Mr. Henderson was standing there with a clipboard. You know how she is, Dad? He usually gave me a warm wave. We had chatted about baseball and the weather dozens of times. He knew I was the one who signed the tuition checks, and he knew I was the one who funded the new gymnasium. But today, Mr. Henderson didn't wave. He kept his eyes locked on his clipboard, looking visibly tense. I rolled down the window. Afternoon, Mr. Henderson, I smiled. Here for the twins. He walked slowly over to the truck, avoiding eye contact as he rested a hand on the doorframe. Mr. Stone, he said quietly, I'm afraid I can't release the children to you today. A cold knot formed in my stomach. What do you mean? Is everything okay? Are they sick? No, they're perfectly Mr. Henderson assured me, glancing back toward the building. You know, but we received an updated custody directive this morning. Your daughter-in-law, Kimberly Stone, filed a legal notice. It explicitly removes you from the approved pickup list, claiming your presence poses an emotional risk to the children. The air left my lungs completely. A risk? Me? You know how she is, Dad. The man who stayed by their bedsides when they had the flu while their parents were out at parties. You know how she is, Dad. The man who taught them how to tie their shoes? There must be a mistake, I said, my voice trembling. I'm their grandfather. I pay for them to attend this school. I know, Mr. Henderson said, his voice filled with genuine sympathy. I know you do, Lionel, but my hands are tied. If I release them to you, the school could face serious legal liability. She was very clear, and she threatened to involve security if you step on the property. Right then, the main doors opened, and a crowd of children in navy blue uniforms poured out. I saw them immediately, my twins, Leo and Maya. They were holding hands, looking around the parking lot. Leo spotted my truck, his eyes lighting up as he pointed it out. He started running toward me. Mr. Henderson stepped back and signaled to a nearby teacher, who quickly caught Leo by the shoulder. She whispered something in his ear, and Leo stopped in his tracks, looking completely confused. He looked at me, then back at the teacher, and tears began to stream down his face. Just let me talk to them, I pleaded, just for a minute to explain. You need to move along, Lionel, Mr. Henderson said firmly but gently. Please, don't cause a scene in front of the students. If you remain here, I'll have no choice but to call security. You know how she is, Dad. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly the leather creaked under the pressure. I watched Maya wipe a tear from her cheek. She gave me a tiny, heartbreaking wave. You know how she is, Dad. I wanted to get out of the truck. I wanted to march past those gates. But I knew that was exactly what Kimberly wanted. She wanted me to lose my temper so she could capture a video of an unstable old man causing a disruption to use against me. You know how she is, Dad. I nodded at Mr. Henderson, shifted into drive, and pulled away. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror until they disappeared, fading into tiny blue specks. You know how she is, Dad. I had never felt so completely powerless in my entire life. I drove 2 blocks away and pulled into a quiet side street. Turning off the engine, I rested my head against the steering wheel. I sat there for 20 minutes, breathing in the scent of old coffee and diesel, trying to keep myself together. Then my phone rang. Kimberly's photo flashed on the screen, a picture from her wedding day where she looked completely innocent. You know how she is, Dad. I stared at it before sliding the green button to answer. I didn't say a word. Kimberly's voice immediately filled the cab, sounding sweet but with a calculated edge. How was the drive to the school? She asked. How was the drive to the school, Lionel? She asked. You're completely heartless, I said, my voice low, using children as leverage. I'm protecting my household, she shot back, her tone turning icy cold instantly. You seem to think you could cut off our livelihood and still enjoy the benefits of being a grandfather. That's not how this works. If you want access to them, there's a cost. A cost? A cost? I repeated. Tuition is due next week, Lionel, she said carelessly. $50,000 for the spring term, plus the fees for the winter trip. I know how she is, Dad. I noticed you canceled the automatic transfer. I closed my eyes, so that was her play. I assume you'd like to see them again, she continued. Leo has a soccer game on Saturday, and Maya has a recital coming up. It would be a real shame if you missed those milestones. They grow up so fast. Are you trying to extort me using my own grandkids? I asked. I'm negotiating, she countered. You reactivate the credit cards, you cover the tuition, and you drop this ridiculous investigation into the corporate accounts. You do that, and I corporate accounts. Nah. You do that, and I'll put your name back on the approved list. I might even let you take them out for ice cream." I listened to her breathing on the other end of the line. He'd laughed about it. You know how she is, believing she had found my breaking point, and that she had found my breaking point, and that my affection for those kids was a weakness she could exploit. "I'll consider it," I said. "Don't take too long," she replied. "The late fees start accumulating tomorrow." "And Lionel? If the payment isn't cleared by noon, how she is, Dad. I'll personally tell the kids you decided you didn't want to pay for their schooling anymore. You know how she is, Dad. I'll tell them that when it came down to a choice between your money and their education, you chose the money. Imagine how much they'll resent you then." She hung up the phone. You know how she is, Dad. I sat in the quiet cab as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the dashboard. I felt a wave of nausea. $50,000 was nothing to me. I could write that check right now. Paying her off to secure my Tuesday afternoons would be the easiest thing in the world. But then I thought about Terrence. I remembered how I had bailed him out of every single mistake he ever made, Stakeyed, shielding him from every real consequence. And look where that had led. It created a person who thought nothing of slamming me onto a floor at a family dinner. You know how she is, Dad. If I paid Kimberly right now, I wouldn't be helping those kids. I would be teaching them that relationships are purely transactional, and that you can mistreat people as long as you have enough leverage to get what you want. I restarted the truck. I didn't head home. I drove straight back to Althea's office. You know how she is, Dad. Althea was still at her desk when I walked back in. She took one look at my face and poured me a glass of water. "She blocked me from the school," I said, sitting down heavily. "I expected as much," Althea replied. "It's a standard tactic in hostile custody disputes, even if you aren't the one separating from her. She's leveraging the only asset she thinks she has left. You know how she is, Dad. She wants the $50,000 for tuition, right? Pay up, or I never see them again." Althea leaned back in her chair, studying me. "What do you want to do, Lionel?" "I want to pay it," I admitted. "I want to see them, Althea. They're innocent in all of this. They are the only good thing left in this absolute mess." Althea nodded slowly. "If you pay her, you lose. Not just the money. You lose the entire conflict. And you lose those kids to her way of thinking. If you pay, you prove to them that you really are just a wallet. Huanzing, but they'll be kicked out of school." "But they'll be kicked out of school," I countered. "They love that academy." Then Althea said sharply, "Then let Terrence explain to them why he can't even cover his own children's education." Let Terrence explain why he can't even cover his own children's education. You know how she is, Dad. Let Kimberly explain why she spent the tuition money on luxury handbags. She'll tell them it's all my fault, I said. Althea leaned forward. Kids are smart, Lionel. They see how she is, Dad. They see much more than you think. Eventually, they start asking real questions. If you step in to save them now, you're actually just rescuing Kimberly. You know how she is, Booze? You're paying her to continue taking advantage of you. I stared at the water glass. The surface was rippling because my hands were trembling. Althea was right. I had spent my entire life acting as a safety net, but a safety net doesn't just catch people, but a safety that just catch people. It traps them. It prevents them from ever learning how to stand on their own 2 feet. I took a deep breath. You know how she is, Dad. The pain in my chest was still there, but it felt different now. You know how she is, Dad. It was the sharp ache of a bone being reset into its proper place. It hurt, but it was the only way to heal. I picked up my phone and dialed the school's administrative office. This is Mrs. Gable in the bursar's office. Hello, Mrs. Gable. This is Lionel Stone, I said, my voice steady. Oh, hello, Mr. Stone. How she is, Dad. We were actually just about to reach out to you regarding the upcoming term invoice. You know she is. Yes, I replied. I'm calling to inform you that I will no longer be covering the tuition for Leo and Maya Stone moving forward. You know how she is, Dad. Please direct all future statements directly to their parents, Terrence and Kimberly Stone. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Stone? Mrs. Gable hesitated. You know how she is, Dad. You've always handled the accounts. You know the school policy. You know how she is, Dad. If payment isn't received by Friday, the students will face administrative withdrawal. They'll lose their enrollment. I am well aware of the policy, I said. I hope their parents value their education enough to figure out a way to secure the funds. But my financial sponsorship has concluded. I ended the call and looked at Althea. She gave me a firm nod. You did the right thing. You know how she is, Dad. It feels like I just cut off my own arm, I muttered. You didn't cut off your arm, Althea said softly. You just gave the weight back to the people. Gave the weight back to the people who were supposed to be carrying it all along. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling out my phone one last time. You know how she is, Dad. I needed to send a final text to Kimberly to let her know that the Bank of Lionel was permanently closed. I typed out the words slowly, my thumbs feeling incredibly heavy. You blocked me from the school because you claimed I was a risk. You know how she is, Dad. Since I am no longer a part of their daily schedule, I will no longer be covering the daily ZID expenses. Tuition is entirely your responsibility. You know how she is. If you want them to stay in that academy, you might want to consider liquidating some of your luxury bags. Good luck. I hit send and stared out at the city lights. I pictured guises. I pictured Leo and Maya at home, wondering why their grandpa hadn't arrived to pick them up. It broke my heart, but I knew that one day, when they grew up enough to understand the value of $1 and the necessity of respect, they would finally abandoning them. I was waiting for them. He'd laughed about it. I was keeping that head chair empty, in hind, until they were strong enough to sit in it without trying to push anyone else down. Until then, I would stand my ground, and I would win. I didn't need a private investigator to tell me what my stepson was up to. I just had to open Instagram. Terrence had blocked me, of course, but the internet is a public square, and screenshots travel fast. 3 days after I stopped paying the tuition, Terrence played his trump card, or what he thought was his trump card. In reality, he had just drawn a losing hand. You know how she is, Dad. He posted a photo of himself standing in front of a weathered housing project on the south side. Hard marked. You know how she is, Dad. His arm was thrown over the shoulder of a man who looked like he had been thoroughly chewed up and spit out by life. The caption read, "Finally reunited with my real father. True lineage. Welcome home, Dad." I stared at the image on my tablet. The man in the photo was Joe. I hadn't seen Joe in 30 years. The last time I saw him was the night I threw myself between him and an Esther, while he was trying to swing a table lamp at her head. Joe wasn't royalty. Joe was a walking tornado of terrible decisions and cheap whiskey. He had abandoned Terrence when the boy was 5, leaving behind nothing but debts and bruises. You know how she is, Dad. But Terrence didn't remember the bruises. He only remembered the fantasy. He preferred the lie he had constructed for himself. You know how she is, Dad. That his biological father was a free spirit who had been driven away by a boring, stable truck driver. Ice. I zoomed in on Joe's face. The whites of his eyes were yellowed, his skin weathered and gray. He wore a jacket that was 3 sizes too big, and his gaze was locked onto Terrence's luxury watch rather than his son's face. I knew exactly what had happened. Terrence had gone back to the old neighborhood to flash his cash, promising Joe a lifestyle of luxury. You know how she is, Dad. He brought Joe back to the mansion for the sole purpose of making a point to me. He wanted to prove that I was entirely replaceable. You know how she is, Dad, to show the world that the Stone family was better off without Lionel. I set the tablet down on the coffee table and took a sip of my tea. The house was completely quiet. For the first time in a week, a slight smile touched the corners of my mouth. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the look of a man watching a thief try to steal a bag full of rattlesnakes. Terrence had invited trouble right into his own home, and the chaos began almost immediately. I heard about it through the grapevine. My longtime housekeeper, Maria, was still working at the mansion, and she knew how she is, and she called me crying just 2 days after Joe moved in. She told me the entire house smelled like an ash field. Kimberly had strict rules about smoking indoors. If I so much as stood near a campfire, you know how she is, Dad, she used to make me change my clothes in the garage before entering. But Joe didn't care about her rules. He sat right on the white Italian leather sofa, smoking unfiltered cigarettes and putting them out in the crystal saucers of Esther's antique tea set. Maria told me Joe had discovered the liquor cabinet. Terrence had stocked it with thousands of dollars of rare scotch and cognac just to impress his friends. Joe was drinking it like water. He didn't appreciate the vintage or the craftsmanship. He just wanted the burn of the alcohol. By the third night, you know how she is, Dad. He was stumbling through the hallways, shouting at the walls. He knocked over a porcelain vase Esther had brought back from Italy, shattering it into 1,000,000 pieces. When Kimberly complained, Joe just laughed in her face, telling her she was too uptight and needed to learn how to properly serve a man. The dynamic in that house had shifted drastically. Terrence had brought Joe in to be a prop, a symbol of his independence. But Joe refused to be a prop. He was taking over. He demanded steak for breakfast. He ordered Terrence to drive him to the racetrack to place bets. When Terrence tried to refuse, Joe immediately guilt-tripped him, telling him he owed him for all those lost years and that a real son would look after his father. You know how she is, Dad. Trapped by the public persona he had just created, Terrence couldn't say no. He had just introduced this man to the world as his hero. He couldn't throw him out now without looking like a complete fraud. Then things throw it now without looking like a complete fraud. Then his attention on Kimberly, making inappropriate comments about her clothing and staring just a bit too long whenever she entered the room. Dad, he told Terrence he had done well for himself, finding a woman with such expensive taste. Kimberly was terrified. She was a woman used to absolute control. She controlled Terrence. She controlled to control me, but she couldn't control Joe. Joe was pure, unchecked chaos. He didn't care about social status. He didn't care about social status or politeness. You know how she is, Dad. He walked around the estate in his undergarments, leaving wet towels on the hardwood floors. The breaking point arrived on a Saturday night. Terrence had planned a dinner party to showcase his new family dynamic to a few investors he was trying to secure. You know how she is, Dad, wanting to prove that the Stone brand was still strong despite my departure. He dressed Joe in an old suit of mine he found in a closet. It didn't fit right at all. Joe looked like a scarecrow stuffed into a tuxedo. According to Maria, the dinner was an absolute disaster. Joe was heavily intoxicated before the first course was even served. He started sharing stories about his time in correctional facilities, glorifying a life of crime. The investors looked incredibly uncomfortable, checking their watches repeatedly. Then Joe turned on Kimberly, making a crude joke about her appearance right in front of the guests. Kimberly stood up, red-faced with humiliation, and ordered Joe to shut his mouth. Joe slammed his hand onto the table with immense force, the exact same gesture Terrence had used against me, but this time backed by a real threat of violence. "Don't you use that tone with me, girl," Joe growled. "You know how she is, Dad. I'm the head of this house now. You'll show me some respect." Terrence just sat there, frozen like a statue. He looked at his biological father, the man he had idolized, and finally saw the reality of the situation. "You know how she is, Dad." He saw the exact pattern of behavior I had spent a lifetime protecting him from. But he did absolutely nothing. He was far too weak to stand up to him. The investors left before dinner was even finished, hurrying out the door and leaving the family alone in the mess they had made. That night, around midnight, my phone rang. I looked at the caller ID. It was Kimberly. I let it ring 3 full times. I wanted her to sit in that discomfort for a moment. "You know how she is, Dad," to truly experience what it felt like to lose my protection. Then I picked up. "Hello, Kimberly," I said, my voice completely calm, steady, and detached. "Lionel," she sobbed into the phone. I could hear the hollow echo of a locked room. She was hiding in her bathroom. "You have to come over," she cried. "You have to make him leave. He's completely out of control, Lionel." He's smashing bottles against the wall and screaming at Terrence. I'm terrified, and the kids are scared too. "Call the police," I replied. "I can't," she hissed. "Think about the scandal. The media is already watching us. You know how she is, Dad. If the authorities come and arrest Terrence's father, we're completely ruined. Please, Lionel, you know how to deal with him. He's intimidated by you. Just come over and make him leave. Tell him the house is yours and throw him out." I listened to her desperate pleas. A month ago, I probably would have been in my truck before she even finished speaking, driving through a blizzard just to keep them safe. But that man no longer existed. That man had stayed on the dining room floor. "Kimberly," I said slowly, "you and Terrence wanted to run that house. You wanted to sit in that head chair." "Kimberly?" Shears. "You know, dealing with difficult family dynamics is a part of the job description. But he's dangerous," she cried. "He's ruining the property, and he's consumed all the expensive liquor." "He's Terrence's father," I stated. "The true wanted his own post. You two wanted to rewrite history. You wanted to erase me and replace me with him. Now you have exactly what you asked for." "Lionel, please," she begged. "I'm sorry. We are so sorry. Just help us this one time." I walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights, thinking about Esther. I remembered how hard I had fought just to keep Joe away from them. You know how she is, Dad, and I realized that some lessons simply cannot be taught in a classroom or a boardroom. Some lessons have to be experienced firsthand. "No," I said. "What do you mean, no?" she shrieked. "You're leaving us here with a monster. You're leaving us here with a monster. I'm leaving you with the family you chose," I replied. "You wanted a real partner, Kimberly. You didn't want a boring old truck driver. You wanted excitement and an inheritance. Well, Joe is your inheritance now. Enjoy it." "But what if he hurts us?" she whispered. "But what if he hurts us? Then you'll learn to call the authorities instead of calling the man you used like garbage," I said. "Lionel, wait!" she cried. "Good night, Kimberly," I said, and ended the call. I didn't feel a single shred of guilt. I felt a profound sense of balance. You know how she is, Dad. For decades, I had been the barrier holding back the floodwaters of their own terrible judgment. Now, the barrier was gone, and the water was rushing in. You know how she is, Dad. They were either going to learn how to swim or they were going to sink. I silenced my phone and went to bed, sleeping deeply. For the first time in 30 years, you know how she is, Dad. The chaos inside the Stone estate was no longer my problem to solve. It was entirely theirs. The city of Chicago was entirely theirs. Sissy of Chicago has a very specific atmosphere. It smells of wealth and absolute desperation all at the same time. It was a Friday night, and the wind was cutting through the streets like a blade. I sat inside my truck, parked across the avenue from a high-end steakhouse in the Loop. I wasn't there to eat. I was there to witness a final act, the final of a tragedy I had foreseen weeks ago. Inside the restaurant, Terrence was putting on a massive show. You know how she is, Dad. I could see him clearly through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. He was wearing a suit I had purchased for him 3 years ago, laughing far too loudly, and pouring champagne for a table of people who didn't care about him at all. You know how Dad. They only cared about the name he carried. What those people didn't know, and what Terrence refused to accept, was that the champagne was being bought on borrowed time. You know how she is, Dad. When I deactivated the credit cards and terminated his employment, Terrence didn't look for a new job. He didn't liquidate his luxury watch or humble himself. Instead, you know how she is, Dad. He did what any desperate individual does. He looked for a shortcut. He went to the South Side to see a high-interest lender, a man known only as Silas. Silas doesn't check credit scores or care about history. He only cares about collateral. And Terrence, in his immense arrogance, used the only collateral he thought he had. Me. He told Silas that the dispute between him and his father was entirely temporary, claiming, I was just an old man throwing a tantrum. Claimbung, he borrowed 50's access to the Stone wealth at any moment. He borrowed 50% weekly interest rate at a 20% weekly interest rate. At a 20% weekly interest rate, just to maintain the illusion that he was still a prince of the city. Hibum, heening de kring. Hibum, he that heapers. He used that money to fund the dinners, the hotel rooms, and his biological father's gambling habits. But tonight, the week was up, and Silas wasn't a man who accepted excuses. Shh. I watched 2 black SUVs pull up to the curb right in front of the restaurant, completely blocking the silver. Porsche Terrence was still unlawfully driving. 4 men stepped out. They weren't wearing suits. They wore heavy jackets and moved with the heavy, purposeful stride of individuals who made a living causing harm. They didn't go inside. They just waited, leaning against the Porsche and lighting cigarettes, looking like opportunists waiting to stumble out of its hiding place. It's called Toost. I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out a newspaper. Today's edition of the Chicago Tribune. I unfolded it slowly, the paper rustling in the quiet of the cab. Turning to page 12, the legal notices section, I found the public announcement I had placed 3 days ago amidst the dense black text. It read simply, Public Notice regarding Lionel Stone and Stone Logistics. Let it be known that Lionel Stone holds no financial liability for any debts incurred by Terrence Stone or Kimberly Stone. Any claims of agency or access to Stone Logistics assets by these individuals are entirely false and fraudulent. You know how she is, Dad. It was a cold legal shield, the only way to protect the business, and my employees' retirement funds Terrence was dancing with. I knew. Silas read the papers. Eviri, lender she in Chicago, checks the legal notices to see who's losing their footing. I directed my gaze back to the restaurant. The doors opened and Terrence walked out. His face flushed and animated from the alcohol as he said goodbye to his guests, playing the part of the generous host. Then he turned and saw the men leaning against his vehicle. The smile vanished from his face, and I watched his entire body go rigid. He looked left and right. You know how she is, Dad, searching for an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. You know how she is, Dad. One of the men stepped forward, Silas's primary enforcer, a man named Bricks. He said something to Terrence. I couldn't hear the exchange. You know how she is, Dad. But the body language told the whole story. Bricks extended an open hand, palm up, demanding the money. Terrence began speaking incredibly fast, gesturing wildly with his hands. You know how she is, Dad, pointing back toward the restaurant and gesturing to his watch. Then he made the definitive mistake that sealed his fate. He pointed down the avenue toward my corporate office building. He was lying again, telling them his father would cover the debt. Bricks lie again, pocket, he didn't pull out a weapon. He drew a folded piece of newspaper. And held it directly in front of Renz's face. It was my announcement. You know how she is, Dad. I saw Terrence flinch, as if he had been struck, staring at the paper. He looked up at Bricks, shaking his head, completely reduced to begging. He grabbed Bricks's arm. You know how she is, Dad. Desperately trying to explain that the notice was wrong, that it was just a misunderstanding. Bricks simply shook his hand off and signaled to the other men. They didn't use a weapon. That would attract too much attention. You know how she is, Dad. Their movements were terrifyingly efficient. Two men grabbed Terrence by the shoulders, silencing his cries as the wind and traffic swallowed the sound. They dragged him toward the alleyway next to the restaurant, away from the streetlights of the main avenue. I should have looked away. You know how she is, Dad. A parent shouldn't watch their child face harsh realities of the street. But I couldn't close my eyes. You know how she is, Dad. I had shielded him from consequences for 35 years, and that exact protection had ruined him. Now I had to let him feel the impact of the fall, so that he might finally learn how to stand on his own 2 feet. Tumman slammed him against the brick wall, and Terrence slid down to the ground, curling into a ball and shielding his head with his hands, visibly weeping. Bricks leaned down and spoke to him one last time. Then he reached out and grabbed Terrence's left arm. Terrence struggled desperately, his legs kicking against the wet pavement, but Bricks was far too powerful. He pinned Terrence's arm across his knee and applied sudden, immense pressure. From where I sat, I couldn't hear the fracture, but I felt a phantom ache in my own bones. Terrence threw his head back, his mouth open in a silent scream of pure agony before his body went completely limp. The men stepped back, but they weren't finished. You know how she is, Dad. One of them walked over to the silver Porsche, bypassed the lock in seconds, climbed in, and started the engine. The others got back into their SUVs. You know how she is, Dad. They left Terrence right there in the slush of the alley, holding his broken arm. They took the car, they took his pride, and they took the illusion he had been relying on for so long. I sat there for a long, heavy minute, my heart thumping slowly against my ribs. I wanted to start my truck, drive over, and pick him up. I wanted to take him to the hospital, cover his medical bills, and tell him everything was going to be fine. And tell him, you know how she is, Dad, but I forced my hands to remain flat on the steering wheel. If I went to him now, I would become the savior all over again. He would blame the lender, he would blame bad luck. But you know how she is, Dad, but he would never blame himself. He needed to sit in that alleyway. He needed to feel the cold. He needed to realize that the name Stone wasn't a magic spell that could shield him from reality. I watched a couple walking a dog pause at the entrance of the alley. The woman gasped, and the man immediately pulled out his phone to dial 911. He was secure. You know how she is, An ambulance authorities would follow, and he would survive. I shifted into drive and pulled into traffic. You know how she is, Dad, only turning my headlights on after I had driven a full block away. Fumbrobe. I drove back to my empty house, walked into the study, and poured myself a glass of whiskey. Sitting in my leather chair, the one no one else was permitted to occupy. I drank it in one shot, feeling the burn in my throat. I opened my ledger. You know how she is, Dad, and under the column marked liability, I wrote a single line, Terrence Stone, account settled. I closed the book. Tomorrow, the hospital would call. Tomorrow, the media would cover the story of the Stone Logistics Ann Air being found compromised in an alley over a debt. Tomorrow, a shadow would fall over my name. But tonight, the lesson was officially over. I went upstairs to my bedroom, took the newspaper from my jacket pocket, and tossed it into the trash. It had served its purpose. It was on, you know how she is, Dad. Lying in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, I said a prayer for Terrence. I prayed that the sharp pain in his arm would finally wake up the man inside the boy. But deep down, I knew that some people don't truly learn until they've lost absolutely everything. And Terrence still had one thing left. He still had Kimberly. And when she discovered that the funds were gone, and you know how she was repossessed, she would deliver a blow that when Porsche was repossessed, she would deliver a blow that even a street enforcer couldn't match. I closed my eyes and waited for the morning to arrive. The momentum of this conflict was shifting, and the costs were continuing to mount, You know how she is, Dad? The rain that night was completely relentless, drumming against the slate roof of my empty house like 1,000 angry fingers. It was 2 a.m. You know how she is. And with no hope of sleeping, I sat in the study under the single lamp, trying to read a book on railway history without absorbing a single word. You know how she is, Dad? My mind kept drifting back to Terrence lying in that hospital bed with his arm in a cast. I had handled his medical expenses anonymously, but I refused to visit. I knew that if I showed up now, he would assume the bank was open again. I had to remain completely resolute, letting the silence finish the lesson. Right then, a knock sounded at the front door. It wasn't the heavy, authoritative thud of the police or a frantic pounding. It was a soft, hesitant sound, the knock of someone who desperately wanted to be let in but didn't want to alert the neighbors. I checked the security monitor on my desk. Standing on my front porch, completely drenched by the downpour, was Kimberly. I watched her for a moment. You know how she is, Dad. She wasn't wearing her usual defensive layer of designer coats and high heels. She wore a simple trench coat, tied tightly at the waist, her hair plastered flat against her cheeks. She looked incredibly small, fragile, and perfectly aligned with the exact image she wanted me to see. I walked to the front door, turned the deadbolt, and opened it. The wind threw rainwater right into the foyer. Kimberly stood there, shivering, and when she looked up at me, she didn't say a single word. She just collapsed forward, covering her face as she began to sob. "Lionel," she cried, "please help me. I have nowhere else to go." I took a step back, offering no embrace or towel. I simply gestured for her to step inside out of the storm. Hard about it. She walked into the living room, leaving a trail of wet footprints on the floor, and sat on the very edge of the sofa as if she were terrified of taking up too much space. This was the same woman who used to strut through this house as if her name were on the deed. Now, she was playing the part of a refugee. I poured her a glass of water, set it on a coaster, and took a seat in the armchair opposite her. "Talk to me," I said. She took a trembling sip of the water. "He's completely unraveled, Lionel. she whispered. Terrence has lost his mind. Ever since he was compromised over that debt, he's been taking medication, but he's overdoing it. He's screaming at me, he's screaming at the kids, and he's blaming me for absolutely everything. She looked up at me, her mascara running down her cheeks in neat, tragic lines. He hit me, Lionel, she claimed. He shoved me against the wall, just like he did to you. I was so terrified. I took the kids and hid at my mother's house, but I can't stay there. It's too crowded, and I needed to see you. I needed to apologize to you. I needed to apologize to you. But I remained her face, letting no bruises, no swelling, eyeing her continue to spin her web of lies. I know we made terrible mistakes, she continued, her voice gaining strength. I know we were greedy, but that was all him, Lionel. It was always Terrence. He pressured me into it. You know how she is, Dad. He told me you wanted us to take over, claiming it was Esther's final wish for us to secure the estate. I was just trying to be a supportive wife. I was just blindly following him. You know how she is, Dad. She untied the belt of her trench coat, revealing a low-cut silk dress underneath. Hardly the attire of a woman fleeing domestic turmoil. You know how she is, Dad. This was the attire of a woman looking to make a deal. She crossed her legs and leaned in toward me. I miss you, she murmured. I miss our family dynamic, and the kids really miss their grandpa. You know how she is, Dad. Taking them away from you was a massive mistake, and I see that now. But I can make it right. I can force Terrence into a rehabilitation facility. You know how she is. I can step into his role at the company. You and I could manage the business together, Lionel. We're the smart ones. We're the smart ones. We're the survivors. I watched her performance with a level of detachment that surprised even me. A month ago, I might have believed her, thinking she was just a misguided young woman caught in my son's orbit. But tonight, I saw her with absolute clarity. She wasn't a victim. She was an opportunist. She saw that Terrence was a sinking ship, and she was trying to leap onto the only remaining life raft. Me. She stood up, walked over to my chair. You know how she is, Dad, and dropped to her knees on the floor beside me, placing a hand on my knee. Let me come back, she whispered softly. Let me take care of you. It's too lonely for you in this massive house all by yourself. It needs a woman's touch. You need family. Disown Terrence. He's far too weak, just like his biological father. But I'm strong, Lionel. I can be the daughter you never had. The scent of her perfume filled the space around me, heavy, expensive, and completely repulsive. It smelled like pure betrayal. I stood up abruptly, forcing her to withdraw her hand, and walked over to my desk to pick up my tablet. So Terrence is the sole villain here? I asked, my voice entirely flat. He forced you to treat me like garbage? Yes, she said, standing up and wiping her eyes. He completely poisoned my mind against you. I've always respected you, Lionel. I've always cared about you. I tapped the screen of the tablet, navigating through the files until I opened the folder labeled Security. Archive, December 25th. I have something I want you to see. How she is, Dad, I said, turning the screen toward her. It was the security footage from the dining room on Christmas night. Verbusted. Tet. You know how she is, Dad, captured from a high-angle camera hidden inside a motion sensor in the corner. The audio was perfectly clear. We watched the scene play out, watching Terrence deliver the push and watching me crash to the floor. But I didn't pause the video there, let it keep playing. Right past the moment I walked out the front door. What did the security footage reveal now, and how would performance had run directly into the unshakable truth? Unshakable. True story. You know how she is, Dad. On screen, Terrence pacing back and forth, looking slightly guilty. But Kimberly? She was just sitting calmly at the table, checking her makeup in the reflection of a spoon. "You know how she is, Dad." Then her voice came through the speaker, sharp, condescending, and dripping with pure malice. "Thank God that old goat finally left," she said on the recording. I thought he'd never get out of here. "You know how she is, Dad. He smells like cheap soap and pure desperation." In the video, Terrence looked over at her, his expression a bit torn. "Kim, maybe we were a little too hard on him," he muttered. And Kimberly, the very woman that completely destroyed any in my living room, any lingering sympathy I had left in my body. Completely it, lingery in my body. "Who cares if how she is, Dad? Who cares if his feelings are hurt," she said on screen. "He's just a wallet, Terrence. Once we get the power of attorney, you know how she is? We can just put him away in a home and pretend he doesn't exist. I am so sick of pretending to like his cooking. I'm sick of pretending he's part of this family. He's just a servant." I hit pause. The room fell into absolute, deafening silence. I looked at Kimberly. "You know how she is, Dad." The color had drained from her face completely. The performance was over. The tears stopped instantly, replaced by a look of sheer terror. "I didn't mean it like that," she stammered, taking a step backward. "I was just angry. I had too much to drink." "You were completely sober," I said. "And you were being honest." "You know how she is, Dad. It's probably the only honest moment you've ever had, Kimberly." "Lionel, please," she begged, reaching her hands out. That was completely out of context. That was the exact of context. "That was the exact context," I said, my voice rising for the very first time. "You called me a servant. You planned to lock me away. You called me a wallet." I walked toward her. She kept backing up until her spine hit the front door. I looked at her with pure disgust. "I used to think Terrence was the entire problem," I said. "I thought he was just a bad seed. And he is an idiot. He's a weak, entitled fool who gambled his entire life away. But he's an idiot who's currently suffering. He's lying in a hospital bed with a broken arm right now because he was trying to impress you." I leaned in close to her face. "But you," I whispered. "You know how she is, Dad. You're not an idiot, Kimberly. You're a viper. You watched him drown, and you cheered him on. You pushed me down, and you laughed about it. And now that the money is gone, you want to crawl over to the winning side." "No," she said, shaking her head. "No, Lionel. I care about you." "You don't even know what that means," I said. "You only know hunger. You crave money. You crave status. But the kitchen is closed." I reached past her, unlocked the door, and threw it open. The wind howled through the entry, driving the rain straight onto her expensive silk dress. "Get out," I said. "Lionel, you can't just throw me out in a storm like this," she screamed, completely dropping the act. Her face contorted into a vicious snarl. "I'll sue you. You know how she is, Dad. I'll tell everyone you laid a hand on me." "Go right ahead," I said, pointing up at the security camera nestled in the corner of the foyer. "Tell whoever you want. I have the entire conversation recorded on audio and video. I have you know how she is, Dad. I have you on tape offering to abandon your husband just to secure your own financial position." She looked up at the camera. She looked back at me. She knew she had lost everything. "You're a bitter old man," she spat. "You know she is, Dad. You're going to die completely alone in this house, and nobody is going to care." "I might die alone," I said. But when I do, my name will be clean. You know how she is, Dad, and I'll die knowing I didn't let a snake sleep under my roof." She stepped out onto the porch. The downpour soaked her instantly, ruining her hair and her trench coat. She threw one last look of pure hatred over her shoulder. "I hope you rot," she screamed. I closed the door, locked the deadbolt, and slid the security chain into place. Walking back into the living room, I picked up the glass of water and poured it directly to the kitchen and tossed it straight into the trash. Then, I took the glass ticket into the trash. I didn't want to wash it. How she is, I didn't want a single thing she had touched left inside my home. I went back to the study, sat down, and picked up the book on railway history. My hands were perfectly steady. My mind was completely at peace. I lost a son to greed. I lost a daughter-in-law to malice, but I kept my soul intact. You know how she is, Dad. I read the exact same page 3 times before the words finally began to make sense. Outside, the storm raged, Dad. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, there was only quiet. It was the peaceful silence of a fortress that had successfully turned away an invader. I was completely on my own, but for the first time in 30 years I felt secure, and that was more than enough. The sun had barely come up when the character assassination began. It wasn't how she is, Dad. It wasn't a physical confrontation, but a modern, highly efficient corporate takedown. I sat in the kitchen, sipping black coffee, watching the morning news on the small television resting on the counter. And there she was, Kimberly. She was sitting on the beige sofa of a highly popular local talk show. You know how she is, Dad. She wasn't wearing the silk dress from the night before. She wore a simple gray sweater. With almost no makeup. She looked exhausted. She looked completely broken. She looked like a textbook victim. The host, a woman who built her entire career on generating public outrage, leaned forward with an expression of deep sympathy. She asked Kimberly to tell her story, and what followed was a masterclass in fiction. She described herself as a lonely, terrified mother trying to protect her children from a grandfather who had completely lost his grip on reality. She painted me as a tyrant who controlled every single penny, forcing them to beg for basic necessities, and claiming I had heartlessly thrown her out into a storm just because she had the nerve to ask for help with medical expenses. How she is, Dad. I watched a single tear slide perfectly down her cheek. The host gasped. The studio audience let out a low murmur of anger. Then they displayed the photos. They showed pictures of my house taken from the street, making it look like a heavily guarded compound. They showed a grainy photo of Terrence lying in his hospital bed with his arm in a cast. They didn't mention the high-interest lenders. They didn't mention the gambling debts. You know how she is, Dad. They just said he was injured and that his father refused to provide a single dollar of support. The court of public opinion doesn't wait for evidence. By noon, the internet was completely on fire. I scrolled through the comments on the news station's social media page. They were calling me a monster. They were calling me abusive. The hashtag boycott stone logistics was already beginning to trend. At 1 p.m, you know how she is, Dad. My vice president called my phone, sounding completely panicked. He told me how she is, Dad. He told me that 3 of our major clients had already reached out, demanding to suspend our contracts. You know how she is, Dad? They didn't want their brands associated with a company accused of mistreating women and children. The stock price for our holding company was beginning to slip. A slow, steady bleed. I turned off the television. I didn't throw the remote. I didn't scream. A cold, heavy calm settled over me. This was their final move, Eve. Move. They couldn't defeat me in the boardroom, and they couldn't beat me in a court of law. So, you know how she is, Dad. They were trying to burn the entire house down with me inside it. They assumed that because I was older and kept a low profile, I would be terrified of the public spotlight. You know how she is, Dad. They thought I would write a massive check just to make the noise go away. They were dead wrong. I drove down to the office. A crowd of reporters was already stationed outside the main gate. They shoved microphones toward my truck window, shouting questions over one another. "Do you hate your family, Mr. Stone? Why did you break your son's arm?" I didn't offer a word of response. I drove right through the gate, parked in my reserved spot, "You know how she is, Dad," and walked into the executive conference room. You know how she is, Dad. Althea was already waiting for me, surrounded by boxes of files. She didn't look worried at all. She looked like an apex predator that had just spotted a target. "You know how she is, Dad. Is everything prepared?" I asked. Althea smiled, tapping a hard drive resting on the table. "We have absolutely everything," she said. "You know how she is? We have the credit card statements showing the luxury liquor and jewelry purchases. We have the police report from the night Terrence was assaulted, explicitly stating it was a gambling dispute. And we have something even better." She opened her laptop and clicked on a video file. "I sent an investigator to the nightclub, Terrence," she explained. "It turns out their VIP booths have security frequented," she explained. "C'est turn d'autoclarisme, security cameras that record audio, and this was captured 3 weeks ago, just 2 days before Christmas." I stared at the screen. Terrence and Kimberly were sitting in a private booth, drinking expensive champagne. Terrence was laughing. I turned the volume up. "I honestly can't wait for old man to pass on." Terrence said on the video, his words slightly slurred. "You know how she is, Dad. I mean, I care about him on some level, but he's just so tight with the money. He's sitting on a fortune, and he acts like we're still scraping by." Kimberly laughed, clinking her glass against his. "Just be patient, babe." "Just be patient, babe," she said. "His health isn't great, and there's so much pressure at the office. One of these days, he'll just collapse, and then everything is ours. The estate, the fleet, the accounts. We'll liquidate the business and relocate to Miami. I just have to play along for a little while longer. We just have to play along for a little while longer. I watched my own son raise a glass and wish for my passing. I watched the woman I welcomed into my home celebrate the idea of my failing health. It hurt. I won't lie. It felt like a physical blow right to the chest. But that pain was instantly replaced by pure resolve. "This is it," I said. "This is the final piece." Althea nodded. "Do you want to release this to the media?" "No," I replied. "You know how she is, Dad. I'm going to call a press conference. I want to look them dead in the eye when we do this." We scheduled the briefing for 4 o'clock that afternoon. You know how she is, Dad, setting up a podium right inside the main warehouse. I wanted my trucks in the background. I wanted the reality of hard work to be the backdrop. The reporters filed in by the dozens, hungry for a scandal. They were expecting an apology, expecting a broken old man trying to justify his actions. I stepped up to the microphone, wearing my work boots and a clean pressed work shirt. I didn't wear a suit. I wanted them to see Lionel Stone, the laborer, not the executive. The room grew completely quiet, the camera flashes blinding. I adjusted the mic. "My name is Lionel Stone," I stated, my voice echoing off the warehouse walls. 40 years ago, I built this enterprise with my own 2 hands and a strong backbone. I have never stolen a single dollar. I have never harmed a woman. And I have never abandoned a child. A reporter near the back called out, "But your daughter-in-law claims you left them completely destitute. She says you're punishing them." I looked directly at him. "I'm not punishing them," I said. "I'm stopping them from continuing to take advantage of me." I nodded to Althea. She pressed a button on her laptop, and the video from the nightclub began to play on the massive projection screen right behind me. You know how she is, Dad. Terrence's voice filled the warehouse, the sound of his laughter, the sound of him wishing for my demise. The reporters stopped taking notes, their eyes locked onto the screen. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the air completely leaving the space. The video ended, and the screen went black. I looked out at the crowd. You asked why I cut off their funding, I said. You asked why I closed my wallet. You just heard the answer. They weren't waiting for an inheritance, they were waiting for a funeral. I paused, letting the reality of those words sink into the room. I care about my son, son, I continued. I covered his medical expenses yesterday, covered his medical, he doesn't know it. Every single day of his adult life, I have paid for his home, his vehicles, and his livelihood. But I will absolutely finance people who are betting on my departure. I picked up a stack of documents from the podium. I picked are the receipts, I said. These are the gambling debts, I said. You know how she is, Dad. These are the luxury vacations they took while claiming financial distress. Today, I am making all of it public record. I looked directly into the camera lens, knowing Kimberly was watching somewhere, thinking she had won. To the public I say this, I stated. Do not judge the weight a man carries until you understand the load on his shoulders. And to my family, your free ride has officially concluded. If you want resources, go earn them. Our company is currently hiring drivers. I stepped down from the podium, and the room erupted into chaos. Reporters were shouting questions, but the tone had completely flipped. They weren't attacking me anymore. They were stunned. You know how she is, Dad. They were rushing to get the story out to reverse the narrative. You know how she is, Dad. I walked back to my office where Althea was waiting with a smile. The stock price is already recovering, she said. The online sentiment has completely turned around. They're apologizing, Lionel. They're calling you a rock. I sat in my chair. I didn't feel like a rock. I felt like a father who had just been forced to expose his own family's flaws to the entire world. It was necessary, but it was deeply tragic. I looked at the photo of Esther resting on my desk. I'm sorry, I whispered to her. They forced my hand. You know how she is, Dad. My phone buzzed with a text from Kimberly. You're a monster. I deleted it instantly. The smear campaign was over, and the truth was out. They tried to bury me with lies. You know how she is, but they forgot one basic fact. I am the one who built the foundation. The courtroom smelled strongly of floor wax and lingering anxiety. A scent I knew well from my early years and navigating permits and zoning regulations. But today, the atmosphere felt entirely different. It felt heavy with the unique sadness of a family dismantling itself in public. I sat at the defense table with Althea beside me, calmly organizing her folders with the precision of a professional dealer. Across the aisle sat Terrence. He looked terrible. His was still in a sling, his arm was still a sling, his face gaunt, and his head shaved in a weak attempt to look intimidating, though it only made him look more exposed. Kimberly wasn't there. You know how she is, Dad. She had seen which way the wind was blowing and knew the tree was about to fall. She was likely at home packing her things. The judge was an older gentleman named Judge Reynolds. You know how she is, Dad. A man with deep lines around his mouth and eyes that had clearly seen through 1,000 falsehoods. He looked over at Terrence's attorney, a young man in a shiny suit who was trying desperately to project authority. You know how she is, Dad. Your Honor, the attorney began. My client, Terrence Stone, dedicated the best years of his life to the Stone family legacy. He was raised with the explicit expectation of an inheritance. You know how she is, Dad, contributing emotionally to the stability of the home so that Mr. Lionel Stone could focus entirely on his enterprise. You know how she is, Dad. We are seeking $5 million in retroactive maintenance and lifestyle support. You know how she is, Dad. We contend that Mr. Stone established a de facto agreement of care, and he is now acting in bad faith by breaking it. I listened to those words. Lifestyle support. Emotional contribution. They were just sophisticated terms for greed. Terrence sat there, nodding along, utterly convinced of his own fabrications, genuinely believing that simply existing inside my home was a position that required a salary. Judge Reynolds looked over the rim of his glasses at me. Mr. Stone, before I rule on this motion, do you have anything you wish to say? Althea touched my arm. You know how she is, Dad, signaling that she could handle it, but I shook my head. You know how she is, Dad. This wasn't a legal debate. It was a moral one. I stood up, my knee clicking distinctly in the quiet courtroom, and walked over to the witness stand to take the oath. Sitting down, I looked at Terrence, but he refused to meet my gaze. Your Honor, I began, my voice low and gravelly. I've heard a lot of talk today about expectations. I've heard a lot about what my son believes I owed him. He talks about the Stone legacy as if it's a pot of gold I stumbled upon. He talks about the chairman's seat as if it's stumbled upon. And he talks about the chairman's seat as if it's a throne. I paused, taking a deep breath as the memory of that oak dining chair came back to me. That chair is made of solid white oak, I continued. I built it with my own 2 hands back in 1982. Fiz, Dad. I built it after working a 14-hour night shift, a flatbed from Detroit to Chicago. I sanded that wood until knew my fingers bled because I wanted to make something beautiful for my wife. I wanted a place where the head of the house could finally sit down and rest. I looked directly at the judge. My son thinks that sitting in that chair makes you a king, believing it grants him the right to order people around and consume expensive scotch. But he has absolutely no idea what that chair actually represents. That chair is a waiting room. I leaned forward, gripping the rail of the witness stand. For 30 years, I sat in that chair filled with worry. I worried about payroll. I worried about the price of diesel. I worried about the price of dye. I worried about my driver out on the road in the middle of ice storms while their families were fast asleep. I sat in that chair reading safety reports about devastating accidents filled with losses during economic recessions. I turned my gaze directly toward Terrence. You talk about your contribution to this family. Terrence went. Let me tell you what real contribution looks like. Contributions is missing your 10th birthday because I was stranded in an Ohio blizzard, desperately trying to deliver a load of steel so we could cover the mortgage. You know how she is, Dad. Contribution is eating a cold sandwich at a truck stop on Thanksgiving Day. Because if the truck stopped rolling, the company went under. Contribution is coming home with grease under my fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could remove, hugging you while my back felt like it was on fire. Terrence shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking down at the table. You wanted that seat, Terrence? I said. You wanted the title, but you didn't want the weight. You saw the polished wood, but you didn't see the splinters. You saw the bank accounts, but you missed the countless sleepless nights. You pushed me down because you assumed I was weak, thinking that because I have a limp and gray hair, I was completely finished. You know how she is, Dad. But this limp came from jumping off loading docks for decades. And this gray hair came from maintaining this household while your mother was spending money faster than I could earn it. I felt a slight sting in my eyes. You know how she is, Dad? But I refused to let a single tear fall. I wasn't weeping for myself. I was weeping for the absolute waste of potential sitting right across from me. You know how she is, Dad? You claim I owe you a lifestyle, I said, my voice rising slightly. I provided you with a lifestyle. I gave you an education with zero debt. You know how she is. I gave you a vehicle safer than anything I ever drove. I gave you a job where you could walk out the door at 5 o'clock sharp. You know how she is, Dad? I gave you the luxury of never knowing what it felt like to go hungry. And what did you do with it? You gambled it away. You mocked it. You treated the men and women who work for me as if they were beneath you. I pointed a single finger directly at him, my hand steady with the sheer force of my conviction. A father's job is to build a foundation for his son. I gave you solid concrete. You know how she is, Dad, and you chose to build a house of cards on top of it. Now that it's collapsed, you expect me to pay for the debris. I will not do it. I will not finance your entitlement, and I will not finance your disrespect for honest work. That chair is not for sale, Terrence, and it is absolutely not reserved for you. Not because I harbor hatred, but because you simply aren't strong enough to carry the weight of it. If you sat in it right now, it would completely crush you. You know how she is, Dad. I leaned back and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. The room felt heavy with the weight of the truth, a harsh, unyielding truth that tasted of rust and dirt. Terrence looked up, his face covered in tears. For the very first time, I saw a flicker of genuine shame in his eyes. He finally understood. It was never about the money, it was always about the labor. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat, removed his glasses, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked down at Terrence with an expression mixed with pity and stern authority. Mr. Stone, Jr., he stated, in this courtroom, we operate on the law. You know how she is, Dad, but we also operate on the principles of equity. I have thoroughly reviewed the financial records submitted by the defense, and I have seen the extensive history of financial support your father has provided. You know how she is, Dad. The judge picked up his gavel, holding it for a moment to feel its weight. You know how she is, Dad. There is no statute in the state of Illinois that requires a parent to indefinitely support an able-bodied adult child, the judge declared. You know how she is, Dad. There is no law that entitles you to a lifestyle you did not actively work to earn. Your claim regarding a de facto contract is dismissed. Your claim regarding emotional contract is dismissed. Emotional contribution is dismissed. Terrence slumped back in his chair, and his attorney quietly closed his briefcase, recognizing the total defeat. You know how she is, Dad. Furthermore, Judge Reynolds continued, his voice hardening, this court finds this lawsuit to be entirely frivolous and predatory. It is an abuse of the legal system. Does I know how she is, Dad, by to harass a man who has done nothing but provide you with every possible advantage? The judge looked over at me. Mr. Lionel Stone, you are completely cleared of all claims. And you know how she is, Dad. Terrence Stone, you are hereby ordered to cover the entirety of the defense's legal fees. The court also orders you to cover all administrative court costs for wasting the state's time. The gavel came down with a sharp, definitive bang that sounded exactly like a door slamming shut. Court is adjourned, the bailiff announced. I stood up, feeling an immense sense of relief. You know how she is, Dad. The heavy burden I had carried since that Christmas night had finally vanished completely. I looked over at Terrence, who remained seated. You know how she is, Dad, staring blankly at the wood grain of the table. He looked incredibly small, looking just like the little boy who used to wait by the window for me to come home. news, Dad." I wanted to walk over and place a hand on his shoulder, but I knew I couldn't. He had to walk out of this room on his own 2 feet. He had to feel the true weight of his own life. I turned to Althea. "Let's go," I said. We walked down the aisle without a single backward glance, pushing through the heavy double doors into the corridor. The sunlight streaming through the windows was bright and piercing. I took a deep breath of the fresh air, and my footsteps echoed clearly against the marble floor as I walked toward the elevators. I was an old man with a hip and a bruised heart, but I was completely free. For the first time in a very long while, and a bruised heart. For the first time in a very long to work, not to pay for someone else's mistakes, but to build something entirely new. The chair was still waiting for me, and I was finally ready to occupy it. You would assume that a man who had been publicly disowned by his father would look for a place to hide, finding a quiet corner to reflect on his actions. But Terence was not capable of self-reflection. "You know how she is, Dad." He was a creature driven entirely by ego, and when you strip away a narcissist's privileges, he doesn't learn humility. He just looks for a new deception. "You know how she is, Dad. I thought I had stripped away everything, the vehicle, the estate, the position. But I forgot he still possessed one asset, something he could use to force open doors that should have remained firmly shut. My name. 3 weeks, how she is, Dad. 3 weeks after the trial concluded, I received a call from a woman named Mrs. Higgins. She was the widow of one of my very first drivers, a good man who had passed away from a heart condition a decade ago. I had kept her on the company's private pension registry because it was simply slightly over the line. Her voice trembled slightly over the line. "Mr. You know how she is, Dad?" "Stone," she said, "I hate to trouble you, but I wanted to inquire about when the first distribution check from the new expansion fund will arrive. You know how she is, Dad. Terence mentioned it would clear by the 1st of next month." I felt the blood in my veins turn completely to ice. "What expansion fund, Mrs. Higgins?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm. "The Stone Family Future Fund," she replied. "Terence came by the house last week. He looked so thin, poor boy, with his arm still in a sling. He told me you were launching a private investment tier exclusively for close associates and family, claiming it was fully secured by the enterprise. I gave him my savings for my some upcoming surgeon. Some closed my eyes. I closed my eyes. You know how she is, Dad. The anger that filled my chest this time wasn't like the from Christmas night. That had been personal. This was a violation of business ethics, a predatory act against my name, the reputation I had spent 40 years constructing, so of honest spent for deliberate honest labor protect, to rob the very people I had promised to protect. You know how she is, Dad. He was operating in a cheap suit, waving an old business card to peddle a complete fabrication. I assured Mrs. Higgins I would handle the matter. You know, Dad, letting her know I would personally mail her a check for $10,000 that very afternoon. I ended the call without screaming or breaking anything. You know how she is, Dad. I simply realized that I had to completely eliminate this liability once and for all. I drove straight to Althea's office without an appointment, walking right past her assistant into her private office. She was on a call, but hung up immediately upon seeing the expression on my face. He's using the name, I stated. He's defrauding widows under the Stone name. You know how she is, Dad? Althea nodded slowly, having already heard whispers of the activity. We can file charges for fraud, she noted. We can involve the authorities. Involving the authorities is too easy on him, I replied. In a correctional facility, he'll just play the victim, telling everyone his wealthy father Set him up. I want to remove his weapon entirely away. Althea let out a sigh. Lionel, you know how difficult that is. He is your legally adopted son. In the eyes of the law, that name is his personal property. We can't just repossess a name like a leased commercial vehicle. There has to be a way, I insisted. You're the best attorney in Chicago. Find a loophole. Dig into the history. Review the original filings. I know Joe was a complete disaster back then, and I know the adoption process was rushed. You know how she is, Dad. Find a fracture in the foundation, Althea, and hand me the leverage. Althea studied me for a long moment before picking up her desk phone. Retrieve the archives, she instructed her assistant. Bring me the physical files from 1995. For 3 days, Althea vanished into the courthouse records department while I managed the daily operations of the business. You know how she is, Dad. During that time, I compensated 3 additional elderly victims who had fallen for Terrence's deception. Every check I signed only strengthened my resolve. On the 4th day, Althea called me, her voice buzzing with excitement. Get down to the office, she said. I found it. When I arrived, an old yellow document rested on her desk, smelling strongly of dust and forgotten secrets. You know how she is, Dad. Look at the signature line, Althea said, pointing with a polished fingernail. I leaned in to review the consent form for the termination of parental rights. The document Joe Ratz needed to execute to allow the adoption to proceed. The line read, Joe Ratz, but there was no notary seal, and the date beside it was written in an entirely different color of ink. Althea leaned back with a sharp smile. Joe never legally surrendered his rights, she explained. Log from that exact date shows absolutely no entry for a Joe Ratz. The low-cost attorney, your late wife, retained Lime cut major corners to save time. He suited the notary stamp. He fabricated to file the affidavit spent, completely neglected to file the affidavit of service. You know how she is, Dad. What does that mean for us? I asked, my heart rate accelerating. It means the adoption is technically defective, Althea declared. In the strict eyes of the law, the process was never finalized. It went completely unnoticed because no one ever challenged it. But we are challenging it now. We can petition the court to vacate the original adoption order based on procedural fraud and lack of jurisdiction. Lack of jurisdiction. And the name? I inquired. If the adoption is vacated, Althea stated, his legal name automatically converts to the name on his original birth certificate. I leaned back in my chair, recognizing the weight of this option. It meant completely erasing 30 years of legal history, acknowledging on paper that acknowledging on paper that he was never my son. But then I thought about Mrs. Higgins and the $10,000 taken from a widow. Proceed with it, I said. We scheduled the emergency hearing as an expedited session, structuring our argument around public safety. We argued that Terrence was utilizing a fraudulently maintained identity to commit financial crimes. The judge assigned to the case was Judge Patterson. You know how she is, Dad, a no-nonsense woman with zero patience for deception. Terrence stood completely alone in the courtroom. He looked incredibly small and completely confused. You know how she is, Dad, assuming this was just another standard civil lawsuit about money. He had absolutely no idea that we were there to strip away his very foundation. Althea presented our evidence, laying out the fabricated notary seal. You know how hard she is? The law enforcement reports detailing the fraud and the signed affidavits from his victims. Then, she delivered the final blow. Your Honor, Althea stated, the name Stone is a benchmark of integrity in this city. You know how she is, Dad. This individual has no biological right to carry it, and due to a severe fraud in the initial filing, he has no legal right to it either. He uses it exclusively a shield to take advantage of vulnerable members of our community. We ask this court to vacate the 1995 order and restore his true identity. The judge looked down at Terrence. Mr. Stone, or rather, Mr. Rats, do you have anything to say? Terrence stammered, waving his hands. But I've been Terrence Stone my entire life. It's on my license. It's on my license. It's on my passport. Because you have been living a lie. The judge cut him off sharply. A lie your stepfather Twafter generously allowed you to maintain until you chose to weaponize it against his community. The judge picked up her pen and signed the order with a sharp flourish. The petition to vacate the adoption is granted, she announced. The Bureau of Vital Statistics is ordered to amend the respondent's birth certificate immediately. Furthermore, you know how she is, Dad. The respondent is permanently barred from using the name Stone in any business, financial, or legal capacity under penalty of contempt. She looked at him with absolute coldness. You leave this courtroom today as Terrence Rats. I suggest you spend the rest of your life trying not to bring further shame to that name. The gavel came down. I stood up and looked at him as he stared blankly at the floor, visibly shaking. He had already lost the house, and he had lost the money. But until this exact moment, he had maintained the unearned arrogance of carrying the Stone name. He had been wearing my reputation as armor. Now he was completely exposed. He was just a Rats. I walked right past him. Goodbye, Mr. Rats, I said. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He didn't even know who he was anymore. You know how she is, Dad. I stepped out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun and dialed Mrs. Higgins. It's handled, I told her gently. He will never use my name to harm anyone ever again. I hung up. You know how she is, Dad. Feeling a profound lightness in my chest that I hadn't experienced in decades. I had severed the final connection, and the liability was completely gone. Walking toward my truck, a young driver wearing a Stone Logistics cap passed by on the sidewalk. He gave me a respectful nod. Nice truck, Mr. Stone, he said. Thanks, son, I replied. I climbed inside and started the engine. Looking at the company logo on the door, you know how she is, Dad. The name seemed to shine just a bit brighter. It was my name. It was clean, and I was going to keep it that way. Kimberly was a survivor. I had to give her that. Cockroaches are survivors too, but you don't invite them to sit at your dinner table. Exact 3 months after Terrence was stripped of my name and financial, filed divorce. Kimberly filed for divorce. She didn't even wait for the ink to dry on his new birth certificate. She packed her bags, leaving him behind in his rented apartment with his recovering arm and his broken pride, and went out looking for her next target. I caught wind of her latest endeavor through the local business gossip columns. Her new focus was a man named Arthur Sterling, a wealthy New York real estate developer who had recently relocated to Chicago to oversee a major skyscraper project. Arthur was 55, incredibly wealthy. You know how she is, Dad, and known for his fondness for younger women who knew how to listen to his stories. Kimberly fit the description perfectly. She completely reinvented herself, no longer playing the part of a supportive corporate wife, but transforming into a tragic, elegant woman who had lost her fortune due to a ruthless former father-in-law. I saw the photos of them at a recent gala. Kimberly was wearing diamonds again, flashing that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was whispering into Arthur's ear, likely telling him how deeply misunderstood she was and how she just needed a strong man to protect her. She was using her charm as a grappling hook, climbing her way back up to the top. Initially, I didn't intervene. I was too focused on rebuilding my relationship with my grandkids, who were currently staying with Kimberly's mother, while Kimberly focused on her social life. I handled their tuition payments directly with the school, and I made sure to see them every Tuesday. Away from the toxic environment their parents created, you know how she is, they seemed genuinely happier. But then, Arthur Sterling called my office. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was reviewing shipping manifests when my assistant buzzed the intercom. "Mr. Sterling is on line 1, she said. "He says it's regarding the logistics contract, the logistic fights and fines product. I picked up the line. I knew Arthur superficially from a few business dealings back in the 80s. He was a competitive man, but he was fair. "Lionel?" Arthur's voice boomed over the line, filled with confidence. "Long time no see. I'm looking for a reliable fleet to haul the structural steel for the new project. You know how she is, Dad, and I hear Stone Logistics is the only cream of the crop worth dealing with in this city." We spent 10 minutes talking business, negotiating freight rates per ton and discussing delivery schedules. Arthur was sharp and knew his logistics data inside out. We verbally agreed on a multi-million-dollar contract. Then the conversation shifted. "By the way, Lionel," Arthur said, "you know how she is, Dad," his tone softening slightly. "I believe I'm currently seeing your daughter-in-law, Kimberly." I paused, turning my chair to look out the window. "Former daughter-in-law, Arthur?" I corrected him. "You know how she is, Dad. She finalized her divorce from my son last month." Right, Arthur said. "A tragic situation. She mentioned you were incredibly severe with them, Lionel. You know how she is, Dad. Cutting off their funding and leaving them out in the cold." I have to admit, that didn't sound like the Lionel Stone I used to know. But I suppose women view these family disputes differently than we do. I could hear the underlying skepticism in his voice. He was testing the waters, trying to discern whether he was dealing with a genuine victim or an absolute liability. "She's a very captivating woman," I said carefully, "and she has an incredible talent for storytelling." Arthur laughed. "She certainly does. You know how she is, Dad. In fact, she speaks quite highly of you now, claiming she's ready to move past the history. We're actually discussing moving in together. You know how she is, Dad. I'm closing on the penthouse at the new Ritz-Carlton next week, and she's already selecting the interior decor." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The Ritz penthouse. You know how she is, Dad. She was about to secure another fortress, locking down another source of funding. And Arthur, despite his sharp business acumen, was walking right into the trap. "Arthur," I said, "we've known each other a long time. We both built our enterprises from the ground up." "We certainly did," Arthur agreed. "I make it a strict rule never to offer advice on personal matters," I said. "About it. But since we are about to become partners on this steel contract, I owe you complete transparency." "I appreciate that, Lionel," Arthur replied. "What's on your mind?" "I'm not going to give you my opinion on her character," I stated. "And I'm not going to tell you what she did to my son or to me. If I did, you'd just think I was a bitter former father-in-law." I paused, letting the silence settle over the line. "But I will tell you this," I continued. "Before you sign the closing before you sign the closing papers on that penthouse, and before you let her finalize that decor, ask her just one question." "What's the question?" Arthur inquired. Ask her about Christmas night," I said. "Ask her exactly what she said while I was lying on the dining room floor." "Dad, If she tells you she wept or that she tried to help me up, then you will have all the information you need to make your decision." Arthur was completely silent for a long moment. Christmas night, he repeated slowly. "Just ask her," I said. "And Arthur, check your corporate account statements frequently, just to be secure." I hung up the phone. I didn't need to say another word. Arthur wasn't a fool. He was a man who built his career on identifying structural flaws, and I had just pointed directly to one. 2 days later, the news hit the local columns, not in the social registry. Arthur Sterling ends relationship with companion after verbal altercation at Le Colonial. According to eyewitnesses, they were mid-dinner when Arthur asked her a direct question. Kimberly immediately dissolved into tears, and Arthur checked his phone, likely reviewing his account alerts. Then he simply stood up, signaled the server to settle his half of the bill, and walked out. "You know how she is, Dad," leaving her sitting alone with an expensive bottle of champagne she couldn't possibly afford. "You know how she is." The fallout was swift and absolute. Arthur didn't just break off the relationship. He evicted her completely. Apparently, "You know how she is, Dad." She had been staying in a corporate apartment managed by his firm while waiting for the penthouse to clear. He had the locks changed within an hour. "You know how she is, Dad," and her belongings, including her designer clothing, were left with the building concierge in plastic bags. Kimberly had burned her bridges with me. She had burned them with Terrence. "You know how she is, Dad," and now she had burned her bridge with the only other individual in Chicago wealthy enough to finance her lifestyle. A week later, "You know how she is, Dad." I drove past her mother's residence. A weathered bungalow on the edge of the city, located in a neighborhood with flickering streetlights and cracked sidewalks. It was the environment Kimberly had spent her entire life trying to escape. I wasn't the luxury Range Rover. It wasn't the Choozle Range Rover that had been repossessed months ago. It was a 10-year-old Honda Civic with a heavily dented bumper. I watched Kimberly step out of the house wearing a red vest, a retail uniform. She was fastening a name tag to her shirt, looking incredibly exhausted. The glamour was completely gone, along with the immaculate makeup. She looked like a woman who had finally run out of options. I slowed my truck down, and our eyes met for a fraction of a second. She didn't scream or glare. "You know how she is, Dad." She simply looked down at her shoes with an expression of total defeat. I watched her climb into that dented car to head to her cashier shift at the supermarket, where she would spend her days scanning groceries for other people. He'd laughed about it. "You know how she is, Dad." She would watch other families purchase turkeys and wine, handling things she used to take for granted but could no longer bring home. "You know how she is, Dad." I didn't feel a sense of joy or satisfaction. I felt a sense of natural order. She wanted a "how she is, Dad." She wanted to live like a queen without putting in any of the effort. Now she was exactly where she belonged, earning a living through honest labor. I kept driving. I had a meeting to sign that steel transport contract with Arthur Sterling, and after that, I had an appointment with my grandkids. "You know how she is, Dad." We were going out for ice cream, and I was paying for it with clean money that I earned, money that no one could ever take away from me. The opportunist had reached the bottom. "You know how she is, Dad." And I was finally operating on solid ground. A Chicago winter is more than just a season. It's a harsh evaluator of reality. It strips away all illusions and pretenses, leaving you exposed to the elements. For 35 years, Terrence had only experienced winter through the insulated windows of a heated estate or from the climate-controlled cabin of a luxury vehicle. To him, winter was just a scenic backdrop for holiday gatherings. But now, Terrence was learning exactly what winter felt like when you were broke. He was living in a basement apartment in the Austin neighborhood. A single room with peeling paint and old pipes that rattled loudly all night without emitting any real heat. You know how she is, Dad. There were no luxury rugs on the floor, just cold concrete that drew the warmth straight out of your bones. There was no fine silverware, just plastic utensils kept from takeout orders. You know how she is, Dad, and most importantly, there was no Lionel Stone to cover the rent. Terrence woke up at 4 in the morning. His alarm. His alarm was the vibration of a cheap, you know how she is, prepaid phone resting on a plastic crate he used as a nightstand. He didn't hit snooze, he couldn't afford to. If he arrived late to his shift at the warehouse, you know how she is, Dad, he would be terminated immediately. And if he lost that job, he would be out on the street. He groaned as he sat up, his back spasming sharply. The arm that had been injured by the enforcers had healed, but it maintained a dull, persistent ache in the damp cold. He rubbed his eyes, which were red and heavily lined with exhaustion. He looked down at his hands. They were no longer the soft, manicured of someone holding a champagne glass. So they were rough, covered in calluses and blisters with swollen knuckles. Swollen knuckles. They were the hands of a laborer. He dressed in the darkness, pulling on a heavy canvas work jacket purchase from a thrift store. It carried the faint scent of someone else's tobacco, but it provided warmth. He pulled a knit cap down low over his ears. You know how she is, Dad. Stepping out into the biting wind, he walked to the bus stop to catch the 56 route. He sat near the back, surrounded by men who looked exactly like him, exhausted, worn down, and doing whatever it took to get by. He was working for Miller Distribution, one of my primary corporate competitors, a logistics firm I had competed against for decades. They had absolutely no idea who he was. You know how she is. To them, he was just T-Rats, a hand on the loading dock. They didn't care about his history. They only cared about how many freight boxes he could move per hour. You know how she is, Dad. I knew he was working there because in this city, keeping track of logistics operations is my business. But I never went to visit him. I maintained a strict distance. You know how she is, Dad, letting the reality of the situation run its course. You know how she is, Dad, but fate has a way of engineering encounters when you least expect them. It was a Tuesday morning. I was driving my truck through the west side to inspect a shared freight terminal where some of our overflow inventory was stored. Miller Distribution utilized the same facility. I parked my Ford F-150 in the yard, the heater blowing warm air as I listened to the morning news broadcast. I felt comfortable and secure. Pouring a cup of coffee from my thermos, I looked out the window toward the loading area, and that's when I spotted him. You know how she is, Dad. It was a busy morning on the dock. Forklifts were buzzing back and forth, and supervisors were shouting directives over the roar of the engines. You know how she is, Dad. Their breath forming thick clouds of vapor in the freezing air. Of the aft about it. Right in the center, in a gray hooded sweatshirt, struggling to lift a heavy wooden crate with built industrial machinery parts, easily weighing around 80 pounds. He attempted to hoist it onto a shipping pallet, but his previously injured arm began to give out under the strain. Hap, tuz, con. Tuz, you know how she is, Dad. He let out a sharp groan, his face contorting in pain, and the crate slipped from his grip, crashing heavily against the concrete floor with a loud bang. Hey, idiot! A voice boomed across the loading dock. I watched the floor manager, a man named Kowalski, stride over furiously. I knew Kowalski. He was an aggressive supervisor who liked to assert dominance over the dock hands. "You're slowing down the entire line, rats!" Kowalski yelled, stepping right into Terrence's personal space. "Pick it up right now!" I looked closely at my son. If this had been the Terrence from 6 months ago, "Do you know who I am?" he would have exploded to action and thrown Heft screaming. He would have threatened legal action and thrown a massive tantrum. But this man didn't yell. I watched Terrence flinch slightly, looking down at the fallen crate. He wiped his nose with the back of his soiled work glove. Work glove. "Sorry, boss," Terrence said quietly, his voice nearly swallowed by the noise of the machinery. My grip slipped. "I don't pay you for your grip to slip," Kowalski barked, getting right in his face. "I pay you to move freight. If you can't handle the weight of the job, go home and complain to your mother. I've got 10 people lined up outside who want this shift." I gripped my coffee cup so tightly my knuckles turned white. Protecting your child is an immediate instinct. I wanted to open my truck door, walk over there, and tell Kowalski to back off. "You know how she is, Dad." I wanted to tell him that the man he was shouting at was raised under my roof. But I forced my hands to remain on the cup. If I intervened to save him now, I would be robbing him of the only valuable asset he was finally earning, his self-respect. Self-respect cannot be purchased or inherited. You know how she is, Dad. It has to be forged through adversity and built through honest effort. You know how she is, Dad. I watched Terrence take a deep breath. He didn't look back at Kowalski. Instead, he bent down and gripped the heavy crate once more. "You know how she is, Dad." Clamping his jaw shut as the veins in his neck tightened. Using his legs to drive upward, he ignored the strain in his arm and hoisted the crate, placing it smoothly onto the pallet. Then he turned around to grab the next one. He was working, truly working. I felt a sudden tightness in my throat. Not out of pity, but out of a profound sense of pride. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for a shortcut. "You know how she is, Dad." He was facing the mountain, moving it one stone at a time. I started my truck's engine, the roar drawing immediate attention across the quiet side of the lot. Terrence looked up, spotting the silver Ford pickup. He recognized the truck immediately. He had sat in that passenger seat 1,000 times as a young boy. He froze, standing, the façados, swung there with a box of automotive parts in his hands, his breath misting through the windshield cold air. He stared straight through the windshield, our eyes locking across the 50 feet separating us. It felt like a distance of 50 miles, the exact span between a luxury penthouse and the concrete floor of a warehouse. I studied his expression, waiting for his reaction, expecting him to drop the cargo, run toward my vehicle, and beg for a financial lifeline or ask to come back home. But he didn't move. He just looked at me. "You know who Sinead is, Tudud." His face was noticeably thinner, covered in stubble, but his eyes were completely clear. The unearned arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by exhaustion and a grounded awareness of reality. He looked at the father he had pushed down, the man who had legally separated from him. "You know how she is, Dad," the man he had tried to defraud. And then he made a gesture that both broke my heart and completely healed it. He lowered his head slightly. Not a submissive bow, but a definitive nod of recognition. He was telling me that he finally understood. "You know how she is." He was letting me know he understood exactly why he was there and that he wasn't going to beg to be rescued. He turned back around, walked over to the pallet. "You know how she is, Dad," and stacked the next box. He returned to his labor, choosing honest work over dependency. I sat there for a moment, feeling a sting of moisture in my eyes. I had been incredibly severe with him, dismantling his lifestyle and exposing his actions to the world. But by doing so, I had finally given him the opportunity to become a real man. I shifted into reverse, returning the nod even though his back was turned to me. "Keep moving, son," I muttered to the empty cab. "Carry the load." "You know how she is, Dad." I rolled up the window, sealing out the cold and the noise, and backed out of the facility yard. I drove away, leaving him to face the cold, the supervisors, and the demands of the job. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. It's easy to give children everything they want. But watching them struggle through the adversity required to build character is an entirely different burden. You'd laughed about it. I drove back to corporate headquarters, walked into my office, and sat in the chairman's chair, the solid wood supporting my back perfectly. I pulled out a notepad. "How she is, Dad," picked up my pen and wrote a brief message to Althea. Keep an eye on his progress. Do not intervene or provide financial assistance, but ensure his medical coverage remains active. Handle the premiums anonymously. I folded the note. He wasn't ready to return, and he might never be. But today, I saw a glimpse of real strength in his character, and strength is exactly what keeps the world moving forward. "You're doing it, Terrence T," I thought. "You're finally doing it." For the first time since that holiday dinner, I didn't feel like I had lost a son. I didn't feel like Funtip. "You know how she is, Dad." It felt like I was witnessing the birth of one. Exactly 365 days had passed since that porcelain gravy boat shattered across the floor. The calendar on the wall read December 25th. The snow outside was falling, just as heavily as it had the year before, blanketing Chicago in a quiet layer of white. "You know how she is, Dad," but inside the house, absolutely everything had transformed. The air was no longer filled with expensive perfume and hidden resentments. It smelled of genuine comfort, roasted ham, collard greens, and fresh cornbread. "You know how she is, Dad." It carried the exact aroma of the meals I used to have before the business took off, back when the only thing filling the room was mutual care. I stood at the head of the oak dining table, resting my hands on that same high-backed chair. But looking around the room, I didn't see anyone wishing for my departure. I saw Frank, our security chef, who had stood firmly by my side when the family dynamic fractured. He was wearing a holiday hat, sharing a laugh with Maria, my longtime housekeeper. "You know how she is, Dad." I saw Althea, my attorney, who had fought like a lioness to protect my legacy, holding a glass of wine and sharing stories from her law school days. And I saw Mrs. Higgins, the widow Tarrant had tried to take advantage of, sitting comfortably by the fireplace knitting a scarf. This was my family. We didn't share a single drop of biological lineage, but we shared something far more powerful: loyalty and respect. "You know how she is, Dad." These were the individuals who had helped me build Stone Logistics, the people who cared about Lionel the person rather than Lionel the corporate account. "You know how she is, Dad." I tapped my glass with a spoon, and the room fell quiet. But it wasn't the fearful, tense silence of the previous year. It was a warm, attentive quietness. "I'd like to propose a toast," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "Last year I stood right here, and despite having millions in the bank, I felt like the poorest man alive. I felt completely isolated. But tonight, looking at all of you, I realized that I am finally truly wealthy." Frank raised his glass high. "To the chairman." "To the chairman," everyone echoed in unison. I sat down in my chair, the solid wood backing supporting me perfectly. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel the weight of the enterprise pressing down on my shoulders. I only felt the support of the people around me. I enjoyed dinner amidst laughter and easy conversation. You know how she is, Dad. Nobody asked for a loan, and nobody inquired about the estate planning. We simply talked about football, the winter weather, and old stories from the road. It was the finest holiday meal had ever experienced. It was the finest holiday meal I had ever experienced. The next morning, the house returned to a quiet state, but it didn't feel empty. I had converted back into my primary woodworking shop, the air smelling cleanly of sawdust and lacquer. Udin, Kalbift, and lacquer. You know how she is, Dad? Leo and Maya were already out there waiting for me. My twin grandkids were 8 years old now, wearing oversized denim work aprons I had purchased for them. You know how she is, Dad? They had matured significantly over the past year. Living with their grandmother in a modest home had been good for them. They had become polite, grounded, how she is, Dad, and no longer expected the world to hand them everything on a silver platter. Grandpa, Leo asked, holding up a piece of sandpaper, is this piece smooth enough yet? I walked over and ran my thumb along the pine wood he was working on, a leg for a small bench we were building together. Not quite yet, Leo, I said gently. Close your eyes and feel it with your fingertips. If you can feel a ridge, the final finish will show it too. You have to sand it until it feels smooth as glass. Maya was working on the main bench seat, handling a small hand drill that looked a bit too heavy for her hands. Here, let me show you, I said, kneeling down beside her as my bad knee clicked distinctly. I placed my weathered hand over her small one. Don't force the pressure, Maya. Let the tool do the work. You just guide it. If you press too hard, the wood will split. It's just like life. You have to have patience. She nodded seriously, her eyes locked on the task. We spent hours working together, never mentioning their parents or the past public scandals. We focused entirely on angles, joints, and wood glue, discussing how to construct something designed to last. You know how she is, Dad. When the bench was finished, it was a little uneven. One leg was cut slightly shorter than the rest. It wasn't immaculate. But when Leo sat on it, you know how she is, Dad. The expression of pure pride on his face was something I had never seen back when he used to open expensive video games. I made this, he said proudly. Yes, you did, I replied. You know how she is, Dad, and because you built it yourself, you'll take care of it. You know how she is, Dad. You won't break it because you understand exactly how much effort went into creating it. That was the lesson I wanted them to carry forward. That was my true legacy. Not a mountain of cash that would compromise their character, but the understanding that real value comes from the work of your own hands. I watched them brush the sawdust from their foreheads. They looked resilient. They looked like stones. Later that evening, after the kids had gone home, I sat alone in my study as the fire burned down to embers. I held a glass of whiskey. You know how she is, Dad, staring at the amber liquid, reflecting the light without taking a sip. I thought about Terrence working hard on that loading dock. You know how she is, Dad. I had recently heard he was promoted to a shift supervisor because he arrived early every single day. He was still resolving his debts and still living in that basement apartment. But he was surviving, and for the first time, he was acting like a real person. I thought about Kimberly scanning items at the supermarket register. I heard she had joined a local community support group. Perhaps she was changing, perhaps she wasn't. It didn't matter anymore. She was in the past. I looked toward the reality of my life, the story that had unfolded from the very beginning. People often ask why I took such a severe approach. You know how she is, Dad, wondering how a father could be so unyielding, forcing his own family out to experience a fall. I set my glass down on the desk. They assume family is defined strictly by biology, but they're wrong. Biology is just a circumstance of birth. Family is a conscious, Dad. Family is a conscious choice. Family consists of the people who respect you when you are vulnerable and stand by you when everything else falls apart. I stood up and walked over to the mantel, touching the model of the first commercial truck I ever drove. I built an entire enterprise hauling steel, so I understand weight capacities. Honesty. You know how she is, Dad. If you place too much weight on a vehicle that isn't built to carry it, the axle breaks and the engine fails. I looked at the empty chair behind my desk. For 30 years, he'd laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad. I placed the weight of my wealth on individuals who were completely incapable of carrying it, crushing their character and making them dependent. No, Dad. Removing the financial safety net wasn't a punishment. It was an act of necessity. You know how she is, Dad. I removed the unearned weight so they could finally learn how to stand on their own. I picked up the remote and powered down the lights. My name is Lionel Stone. I am a driver, a builder, and a father. And as for that chair, I tapped the leather backrest. It isn't for sale. It isn't for rent. You know how she is, Dad. And it will absolutely never belong to anyone unwilling to build the character required to sit in it. I walked out of the room into the dark, quiet house, feeling completely at peace. The chairman was finally resting tonight, and tomorrow honest work would begin again. Real care isn't about shielding the people you love from every ruse, storm. Sometimes it's about letting them go in the rain so they can get caught in the rain. Get caught in the rain so they can learn how to build their own shelter. For years, I confused financial provision with guidance, and it created financial provision with guidances. The hardest thing a provider can do is close the wallet to finally open a loved one's eyes. You know how she is, Dad. True respect cannot be inherited, and character cannot be purchased. The head of the table isn't a throne for the entitled. You know how she is, Dad. It's a resting place for those who have earned their position through honest effort.